Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to today's MWI speaker event with Dr. James Giordano. Dr. Giordano is a professor in the Department of Neurology and Biochemistry, chief of the Neuroethics Studies Program of the Pellegrino Center for Clinic Bioethics, and co-director of the O'Neill Pellegrino Program in Brain Science and Global Health Law and Policy at Georgetown University Medical Center. As well, Dr. Giordano currently serves as an appointed member of the United States Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Advisory Council on Human Research Protections. He is a researcher and task leader of the European Union Human Brain Project and has served as an appointed member of the Neuroethics Legal and Social Issues Advisory Panel of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and Senior Advisory Fellow of the Strategic Multilayer Assessment Branch of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon. It's quite a bit. In his spare time, he has authored over 260 publications in neuroscience and neuroethics, 7 books, and 13 government white papers on neurotechnology, ethics, and biosecurity, and is an editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Philosophy, Ethics, and Humanities in Medicine. Dr. Giordano, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. No. Don't applaud now. Wait till the end because the performance pressure is much too severe if you do that. And my thought is you're probably not going to applaud at the end, but what I'm going to hear is the slamming shut of your sphincters with fear. That's good. That's been successful. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to be here. Is that Yoshi in the audience? Hello. No PDAs, but I do want you to come up and say hello. Your mother says hello. Everybody has a mother, and I know hers. So what we're here to talk about today is the fact that the brain is and will be the 21st century battlescape in many ways. End of story. We could stop it there and I could let you go back to your respective units and think about that for a while, but I'm here to tell you absolutely, as much as there's a big old Tyrolean nose on this face, that you will encounter some form of neurocognitive science that has been weaponized not only in your military career, but in your personal and professional lives, irrespective of whether those two things coincide or not. So the idea of the brain as the battlescape is very important. And more importantly is this other acronym that's up there, which is WMD squared. Please get used to this because this is going to be part of the idea of irregular warfare and ongoing military innovation in your careers. Weapons of mass destruction and disruption. Disruption and influence will be the key to creating peer capabilities and asymmetrical engagements. Let me say it again. It will be the key to creating peer capability and asymmetrical relations and engagements. If we talk about what brain science is, let me just give you a little bit of brief background on this field that is now called neuroscience. As a titular field, as a named field, neuroscience has only been in existence for 40 years. I know that because I've been a neuroscientist for about 38 of those 40 years. When I first applied to get into a program in neuroscience, there were only 4 neuroscience programs in the continental United States, 4. Right now, at this particular point, there are well over 200 dedicated university and collegiate programs, several programs at the junior college level, several programs at the high school level, and many, many dozens of independent think tanks and philanthropic organizations solely devoted to brain sciences. That's just here in the United States. Furthermore, what becomes critically important for you to understand is that brain science is not just a United States enterprise or effort, nor is it singularly an effort of the United States allies worldwide. Increasingly, it is becoming an international, multinational, global, and independently exercised event and endeavor, which increases the capability of the brain sciences to develop not only new theories, but ever more sophisticated tools. I like this slide a lot because what it presents for you, ladies and gentlemen, is a century-long history of brain science, even before it was called neuroscience. Look, let's face it, for as long as human beings were looking in some reflective pool and recognized that the thing looking back at them was themselves, there was some interest in what makes me, what makes me think, what makes me feel, what makes me behave the way I do and you behave and think the way you do. What is my sense of self? Do I have free will, and what is the nature of that, and how can we affect that in a variety of ways that go from the non-kinetic all the way to the kinetic? If we take centenary jumps into the era of the Enlightenment, we can see the great thinkers that came before and during the Enlightenment, inclusive but not limited to people like René Descartes, pondered the idea of what that means. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The inverse of the statement that in many cases was implicit but now becomes ever more explicit is what makes me think. And if I can understand what makes me think and makes you think and makes you feel, then that understanding may in fact flavor, if not directly influence, the way you and I interact. But more than that, If, in fact, I understand how it is that your brain does what your brain does, I may be able to access your brain and affect your brain, indirectly and directly. And what this allows us to do is to create tremendous potential and possibility and probability, potential, possibility, and probability of what the brain sciences can do and will do. Remember these three letters, A, and A. Keep them as your viable mantra for the duration of this course, today, and throughout your professional careers and each and all of the opportunities that you have to interface and try to understand the power that the brain and cognitive sciences can yield. A, the ability to assess the brain and its functions. A, the ability to access the brain on a variety of levels, from the subcellular all the way to the social. And A, the ability to affect the brains and the individuals in which those brains are embodied and the ecologies in which those individuals enact, engage, encounter, from the level of the individual to the group, to the community, to the populational. Look at the power that understanding tools and techniques of the brain sciences afford. It's there before you on the screen. Obviously, if in fact this gives me some insight to the way people interact, inclusive of the way they may interact in bellicose, aggressive, violent, and volatile ways, and it also confers upon me certain powers to be able to influence that, alter that, change that, mitigate that, then clearly I'm able to use the brain sciences, as we have tried repeatedly in the past, to influence the postures and capabilities not only of our own individuals who are engaged in warfare, intelligence, and national security operations, but those who seek to threaten us. In other words, we can utilize these things in national security, intelligence, and defense. Please look at the timeline. A mere 10 years ago, in 2008, the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council convened a group to create a report dedicated to if and why and how brain sciences might be viable, valid, and of value in national security, intelligence, and defense operations. And in 2008, they did a 5-year retrospective and came to the conclusion that although these things may be valid, their relative viability and value at that particular time rendered them not ready for prime time play. Our group, working with others internationally, inclusive of the Nuffield Council in the UK, proceeded forward from 2008 and did a slightly deeper dive, looking at international capabilities, limitations, and delimitations in the brain sciences, and came to a very, very different set of conclusions. Not only were the brain sciences increasingly being considered, interested, and used for possibilities of national security, intelligence, and defense, but they would continue to be so as more and more countries internationally developed the capabilities and the specialized agendas to be able to look into the brain and affect the brain. So much so that by 2014, the exact same committee reconvened and recognized at that time that the brain sciences indeed were ready and in operational prime time for warfare, intelligence, and national security agenda. In other words, it is valid, valuable, and already in operational play. The brain is the current and future battle space, or at least one that can be leveraged in those ways to be able to create tremendous effect with fairly little investment of engagement. In other words, what it allows us to do is assess the brain, access the brain, and affect the brain. I'll unapologetically repeat myself throughout this lecture to drive home this point with regard to these capabilities, because each and all have gravitas importance and operational leverageability. That said, what are these techniques and technologies that have rendered this capability and, if you will, geopolitical, military, and social power? Well, I have them here before you. Generalization, we could parse them down into two discrete domains. First, the assessment neurotechnologies that do exactly as the name would imply. They are based upon various tools that we can use to assess those structures and functions of the brain that may be involved in those processes of cognition, emotion, and behaviors. Humans are tool users. Rarely, however, do we turn over a rock, look around a corner, or peer under the bed just to know what's under there. We use, at very, very least, the knowledge we have gained from turning the rock over and looking under the bed or around the corner. And very often, those things that we find under the rock, under the bed, or around the corner become tools for us to use in a variety of other engagements. Brain science, like any other science and technology, is no different. Earlier in the day at lunch, Major and I had a conversation about the viability of different types of research. Science for science's sake. Science just to know because that's where your interests lie. Oh, look, I've been an academic for well over 4 decades. And I can tell you that that kind of research is wonderful. But when that research is generated for a purpose and when it's funded and when that purpose deals with those things that are near and dear to the health, survivability, flourishing, and protection of kith and kin, then that research is operational research that has an end goal of use. This is what this is about. It's not just a question of trying to figure out what makes the brain tick in the way it's built. It's can we get in there to affect the ticking and talking, and by affecting the way that brain is built and the way it functions, influence in ways that are kinetic and non-kinetic the attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, activities, and relative vulnerabilities and predispositions of those individuals for whom both we are responsible in terms of our own forces, perhaps to make them better, more insulated against injury, operationally protected and enhanced, and those who may threaten us. To do that, we need to intervene. So the other dimension of these neurotechnologies are interventional neurotechnologies. Now, I'm not going to bring you down the rabbit hole into what each and all of these things do, because you don't want to be a neuroscientist, and I'm certainly not going to make you a neuroscientist in an hour. But I think it becomes important to dial into a little bit more clarity and with further granularity what we're really talking about when we talk about these relative assessment and interventional technologies. In the former case, probably the one that gives the most rise to both provocation and contention, are various forms of neuroimaging, the ability to image the living brain, to be able to see what brain areas are differentially active as we engage in different thoughts, feelings, emotions, and tasks, and to then correlate the interaction of those nodes and networks with discrete patterns that occur not only in individuals, but in groups of individuals. In other words, if I can see how this gentleman's brain works, whether he's awake or falling asleep, thought I'd catch you. The idea there is that I can then understand, I'm only kidding, I can understand better, relax, I can only understand better not only what makes him happy, agitated, engaged, or tired, but I can then in some way alter my discourse to be able to make him feel happier, more engaged, and less tired. In so doing, I can take the information I have about the way a brain works, and I can put it to good use, practical use. Think about this. If I know what makes you tick as an individual, and I'm then able to generate patterns of how you as an individual relate to, are similar to, or different from other individuals, I may be able to then generate information that allows me to interact with you on ways that are more meaningful to our level of interaction. In other words, the more I know about what makes you tick, the more my interactions can be geared with you to make you tick the way I want you to. The way I want you to. Obviously, it takes some energy to put people into a big magnet and scan their brain. There's a whole bunch of things that are limitations of brain imaging. We recognize that. That's part of the mission. We seek to delimit those particular constraints and through the use of co-registered different forms of neuroimaging make it better. Some of these forms of neuroimaging are fieldable, operationalizable in field missions. Some of them are not. We're seeking to make these things more operationalizable, not only for military medicine to assess individuals who may have incurred brain injury and or the effects of brain injury inclusive of things like PTSD and other forms of neuropsychiatric disorders, but also to understand better how it is that our individuals are able to think through certain situations, how their brains work, and be able to classify those individuals and perhaps specify the way we train them, the way we sustain that training, and then we maximize their performance. We can use other methods as well, genetics, biomarkers, and information. And that information is critical. One of the things you must learn is as military personnel, your demographic, biological, social, and psychological information exists in your jacket and is in fact retrievable in real time. That information becomes ever more important as we try to understand the you-ness of you. And the nature to classify that information, hold that information secure, doesn't only exist on the medical side with regard to your HIPAA records, but increasingly is becoming a concern for national security when these large-scale big databases of brain structure and function, physiology, biopsychosocial demographics become ever more available and ever more relevant to what's making you tick, what's making you talk, what's making you strong, and what's making you vulnerable. And the fact that other nations, inclusive of China and Russia, are engaging in large-scale neuro-big data initiatives to be able to create large-scale databases that can join not only imaging and physiological, but as well as other forms of phenotypic and genetic data of the entirety of populations renders great power because there's great capability in that information to know where key points of strength and vulnerability may lie, and also to intercede, to inject information in some way be able to affect what appears to be your medical record, your personal record, the evidence that is you. And we can take that step to go one step further. The more I know about you and the more I know about the way your brain works as individuals, groups, communities, and even populations, the more I can utilize non-kinetic means such as informational means of narratives, iconographies, semiotics to influence your emotions and your behaviors. We can do this subliminally through computer images. We can do this more liminally through the types of engagements, interactions that we engage through psychological operations and informational operations. We can train better our human terrain teams to be able to interact with individuals in a variety of cultures, groups, settings, and ecologies to be able to improve their performance so as to be less distancing and more ameliorating. We can go further than that as well. We can also utilize these interventional technologies in those ways that may able to directly affect the brain. Probably the one that you've heard about most recently, most contemporaneously in the literature, is the possibility to use some form of directed energy to affect physiology peripherally and also to affect the physiology and health of the brain. Case in point here, US Embassy personnel in Havana and possibly in China. And of course, there's not a lot that I can tell you about that, although I am one of the researchers on that particular project. But this seems to be wholly indicative and supportive of the fact that this was at least some form of directed energy, whether it was wholly intentional or not, still remains to be definitively decided. However, the pattern of insult and injury to those individuals and the pattern of injury of who was affected strongly suggests that this was an intentional and directed engagement, and that this represents a beta test, a possible probe of a directed energy neuroweapon. And there are a number of countries that have developed initiatives and agenda towards developing just these types of things, the United States included. But you also have a whole host of other things that can go bump and bang in your brain. The more we understand the specificity of the brain on a very granular level, the more we're able to derive and develop particular types of drugs that not only can enhance and optimize the performance of our people, but can also be used to mitigate, militate, and in some cases manifest profound morbid changes in their people. In other words, against a hostile other. Drugs can be exceedingly specific, and as I'll show you in a moment, can be very, very much used to individualize weaponology in terms of what we call precision pathology or precision effect. We can go further. Clearly, one of the things we can also do is transcranial neuromodulation, the idea of going through the skull to modulate the node and network activity of the brain, to optimize the performance of key individuals in certain tasks and performances that are relative to their missional space. And we can also do that against hostile or perhaps belligerent others. We can go further to implant certain brain-machine interfaces. These are many of the DARPA programs that you may hear of now. Probably the one that is most notorious, in a very good sense, is something called the N3 program, which is the non-invasive neurosurgical neuromodulation program being run by their program manager, Dr. Al Mundi. The idea here is to put minimal-sized electrodes in a network within a brain through only minimal intervention to be able to read and write into the brain function in real time, remotely. The United States is not alone in such efforts. And then, of course, you also have the things that are a little bit more traditional. If we talk about things that can be operable in the biochemical space, we ordinarily talk about drugs, bugs, toxins, and ever more, we're considering devices. At the last Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, the RevCon, it was then raised by the Australia group that we need to be a little bit more salient in our attention to those possible neurotechnological devices that may be able to be weaponized. Our group has also argued that the current considerations and extant categories of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Conventions are not detailed enough to be able to appreciate or keep pace with the advances in this form of science that can be weaponized that poses a risk and threat on the battle space. So, how then can we use these elements as weapons, means of contending against others? Formal definition of a weapon, right out of the Oxford Old English Dictionary. Means of contending against others. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can militate their behaviors and their thoughts in some ways as to make them more amenable to what we do, the idea of positive weaponology. Or we can, in fact, mitigate and, in some cases, completely nullify their capability, will, or engagement to fight. If we combine those two definitions into one, what we find is those agents that will either change individuals' thoughts, vulnerabilities, volatility to violence and aggression, or incur morbidity, dysfunction, and or mortality in such a way as to then mitigate the engagement altogether. You still with me? That said, we can break down any form of weaponology into two discrete categories: soft weapons and hard weapons. In the former categorization, soft weapons include but are not limited to such things like economic leveraging to create economics, market values, market presence, presence at international bargaining tables to develop international power and leverage as a soft weapon. Clearly, the more we're able to make an impact in a field, in a dimension, by virtue of research, medicine, technology, infiltration into a variety of areas of the public space, the more we're able to yield economic strong-arming, economic leveraging. I think an important consideration that I'll reiterate later in this particular lecture is that there are countries outside the United States and or the West that are increasing their capabilities by intent in the brain sciences so as to be able to gain this type of economic leveraging in international global markets, in medicine, science, technology, and the military. Most notably among them is China. We'll talk more about that momentarily. But we can also utilize weapons in more of a soft approach, as I mentioned earlier. The more I know about what makes you tick, the more I might be able to do things like weaponize the approach that I then take towards you in my interactions and engagements with you. Here we can utilize the brain sciences for psychological operations. Most notably, one of the DARPA programs run by the program manager Bill Casebeer, Dr. Bill Casebeer, who subsequently went on to be a program manager at Lockheed Martin and run their brain-machine interfacing programs. Bill Casebeer's program was called Narrative Networks. And one component of the Narrative Networks project was something called neural narratives. If we understand how it is that brains and individuals, groups, and populations respond to certain forms of imaging, memes, iconographies, engagements, the more we may be able to tailor those things through our psychological operations, propaganda, meso, to be able to engage these individuals in more positive ways or in ways that are more influential, to be able to direct their behaviors, their predispositions, and perhaps their engagements with us on a variety of levels from the individual all the way up to the political. But then, of course, we move into the more harder forms of weapons, things such as bullets and bombs. And here, once again, let me reiterate what we're talking about on the neuro side are drugs, bugs, toxins, and devices. But of course, if we spill over the idea of soft weaponology into a hard weaponization, we also see the use of biodata as a viable weapon. Manipulating biodata so that I can then put into your particular medical records subtle information that may change the disposition of whether you're sick or not, change how you're treated, influence the postures that go to you in terms of insurance, care, viability for military service. By altering that information, by changing those data, by purloining those data, I essentially changed the you of you. And I can do that in very subtle and insidious ways. Furthermore, I can do that on a variety of different levels that can affect key individuals so that, in fact, your medical record changes to thereby render you incapable or at least invalid to be able to serve in a way you're serving. Or I can do that on a much larger scale, groups, populations. And if I change those data, I change the way you're being regarded and treated. And I can do that in one of two ways. I can do it in such a way that you're going to be regarded in a negative sense, or I can do that in such a way that I'm going to treat you incorrectly. If I say, for example, you have a particular allergy, or you have particular sensitivities, or you have a particular disorder, you will be treated for that, and that could then harm your health and your stability in both a short wars approach as well as a long wars approach. But if we take a look at this in a little more detail, you can see that once again it folds back to the idea of what can we do to ours and what can be done to others. Clearly, one dimension, one domain of operational viability and value is to enhance the capabilities of the combat and intelligence operator across a range of scalabilities in both general purpose and more select forces. And this is the idea of neuro-enablement. Neuro-enablement. You will hear this referred to in a variety of different ways. Performance optimization, enhancement, enablement, maximization. These terms mean something. A number of years ago, our group was tasked with the Air Force to develop a lexicon, a nomenclature, that would be able to define these in more precise ways. And I'll not bore you with that now. But the idea of enablement gives forth, I think, a particular meaning that's relevant. You're enabling individuals to do some aspects of a performance of a task that is germane and justified to their operational mission, and that is, in fact, done with regard to protection of their charges. So in other words, we're saying, we're going to make you good to go, and we've decided that this is good. The reason this can become problematic, of course, is that what definition of good are we using? What we define, whoever the proverbial we may be, to be good, might be quite different than what they, whoever the proverbial they is. And as a consequence, we have to keep a much broader window of opportunity and possibility open to be aware for the potential benefits, burdens, and risks that this type of engagement may pose. What types of things can we do to make our people better, if you will? Well, certainly we can use a variety of advanced psychopharmacologics and neuropharmacologics, in other words, drugs. And I refer you to a wonderful book written by a colleague of mine, Professor Jonathan Moreno, called Mind Wars. First edition came out in 2006, second edition came out in 2012. And Professor Moreno does a very good job in defining and explaining the history and historicity of the way the brain and cognitive sciences had been used in national security, intelligence, and defense operations, both by the United States and more globally. And what we see is that this is certainly not a new event. We can look back into antiquity and see that there have been attempts to try to maximize the performance, capability, sustainability, and protection of those individuals who are operational warfighters, literally from ancient Rome and Greece all the way to the 20th and now 21st century. It's the tools and techniques based upon the understanding and depth that we have that increases the granularity and specificity of effect and increases sophistication and gravitas of outcome. The more we know about the brain, the more we can develop ever more selective agents to affect the structures and functions of the brain in cognition, emotion, and actions, and the more we can do so in a way that's more like sharpshooting rather than buckshotting. But irrespectively, drugs can be somewhat dirty. What I mean by that is they can have a host of adverse effects, some of them side effects, some of them direct effects. And very often what we'll find is that unless we're able to deliver the drugs directly to a particular site in the brain or elsewhere in the nervous system, they can have heterogeneity of effects throughout the body. And that can lead us to some undesirable outcomes. But we don't need to be limited to drugs. No. We can also use a variety of computational brain-machine interfaces that are both closed and open loop. And these include things like transcranial magnetic and electrical stimulation, stimulating the vagus nerve transdermally, or if you wanted to get somewhat more invasive, but certainly more specific, brain-machine interfaces by virtue of deep brain and superficial brain implants. And I shall tell you that one of the leading projects in developing state-of-the-art brain implants is a DARPA-funded project aimed at the medical side for the treatment of neurological and neuropsychiatric spectrum disorders. And this program is called SubNets, Systems-Based Neurotechnologies for Emerging Therapies. But what you also need to appreciate is that that DARPA program, like any program that is oriented towards engaging brain function to then alter those functions in certain ways, directional ways, can be harnessed for what's called dual use. Medical purposes that are then depurposed to medicine and used for other agenda, inclusive of warfighter enablement and enhancement. Furthermore, we understand that there are a number of nations outside the United States, some of whom are allied, others that are at least competitive, if not combative, that are engaged in these types of programs looking at the capability for transcranial and deep intracranial modulation of brain function to improve the functional performance of military and intelligence operators across a range of viable missional tasks. We are not alone in these pursuits, and I think that's something that needs to be appreciated. But it's not just a question of what we can do to our own, because very often in raising these questions, we tend to, what I call, err on the side of moral probity, and we recognize that there are particular limitations, limits, boundaries, thresholds that cannot and perhaps should not be crossed in terms of what we can do. And if we intend to cross them, we only cross them with consent, and that consent is highly contingent upon the necessity of a continuity of research and clinical care, understanding what happens to the individual once they've been enabled and enhanced, and what may happen when they're no longer enabled and enhanced. In other words, more colloquially, when Superman goes back to being Clark Kent, what happens to Clark becomes the burden and obligation of our responsibility. However, those ethics are not homogeneous on the world stage. And the idea of pushing the envelope of what can be done to the combat, warfighter, and intelligence operator, and perhaps more broadly to those individuals who may oppose particular regimes and or may be military fighters against your own regime, is very often bounded by, and in some cases deconstricted by philosophies, cultures, and ethics of those individuals who may be competitive, if not combative to us. So in other words, this can also be weaponized against others. And this is where we get into the idea of novel neuroweapons. Once again, this is not necessarily new, but the momentum of this dimension of the field has accelerated as a consequence of increased understanding of the brain and increased capability to develop tools and techniques to access and affect the brain. So what are we seeing here? Well, take a look. We see in-close neuropharmaceuticals and organic toxins. What's new about this is the in-close nature of this. Increasingly, we're not seeing these things as weapons of mass destruction against gross aspects of the population, although certainly many neuroweapons such as sarin gas and VX and other forms of neurotoxic agents can be leveraged against large groups of people, but that's messy. More specifically, perhaps, might be targeting individuals on a level that allows either direct attribution or covert engagement with non-attribution. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So this gentleman is the leader of some group, a political group, a social group, a combative group, and under the veil of a white flag, he and I are now to have some kind of a caucus, a meeting. And during that meeting, what I do is I lace the rim of his drink, or his pen, or his seat, or something in his immediate environment with very, very low-dose drug or toxins that are going to affect his stability. They may affect the way his brain works, and as a consequence of that, they can affect the functions of his brain, his thought patterns, his relative emotionality, and the behaviors that go along with that. One of two things might happen. He might be completely incapacitated as a consequence of this, or he may change his level of capacity and engagement so that he went into the meeting thinking, I hate this guy's my enemy. He walks out of the meeting going, I love this guy's great. Now what could happen? If in fact this is a gentleman who has charismatic, financial, elected, or dictatorial power, it may be that his followers will then follow him blindly. He came into the meeting as a leader of those followers who were bellicose, who were volatile, who are violent and aggressive. He comes out of the meeting and he tells them to change their behaviors, and they do. Or I could sever the trust. By now, he leaves this meeting, he's espousing a very different philosophical stance and orientation, and his followers no longer adhere to his precepts, his tenets, or his lead, and I fractured the relative arrangement of trust, engagement, capability that he fostered, leaving that population disrupted and vulnerable to intervention, to a coup d'etat, to a junta, to some type of insertive reassumption of leadership. You see how this can work? Furthermore, I can use this very tactically. Some of these agents allow me to assemble the agent on site and not have to stockpile it, which allows me to take the components of this agent into and out of a country, relatively covertly, target a specific individual, change or eliminate that individual with very little attribution and trace, and be able to leave prior to any attribution. Think Novichok. Or I could assemble very small quantities of this that would then allow a specific intervention, characteristically in a place that would not allow such an intervention. Think of the use of a derivative of Vx in an airport. But I could do more than that. I could also incur much broader type of ripple effects. And one of the ways I could also do that is with what's called high morbidity neuromicrobiologic agents. It's a real fancy way of saying neurobugs. But high morbidity neurobugs. I may not want to kill a lot of people. In fact, arguably, I may assume what is sometimes referred to as the Sailor-Malin mantra. For those of you who may be fans or students of military history, you may remember that Sailor-Malin, Wing Commander Sailor-Malin, was a South African who flew with the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. And he became well known during the Battle of Britain for shooting up German airplanes but letting them limp home, particularly bomber aircraft. And they would ask Sailor-Malin, oh, Wing Commander, why didn't you shoot that plane down? And his adage was simple. Better to have that plane return home with wounded crew who are spitting up their lungs, one dead crewman that they had to attend to and therefore divert their missional capability while in flight, than shoot them down. Because the psychological effect will be rippling and devastating. This is sometimes referred to as the Malin effect. What can I do? I can use a particular bug that I may be able to now modify through the use of gene editing technique that is ubiquitously available and fairly easy to use to take a bug that was previously relatively benign and non-pathogenic and make that bug virulent, pathogenic, dangerous. And then what could I do? I could introduce that bug in key sites. Des Moines, Seattle, Tampa, Newark, Houston. I'd get a few people sick. I'd do it on an airplane, do it at an airport, do it at a sporting event, do it on Black Friday. And then what I would do is I would take credit for that, but I'd want to make sure that at least part of the symptomatic constellation was not only neurological, was profoundly psychological. Agitation, debilitation, sweating, stomach problems, sleeplessness, cardiac problems, things that are what we call top-down neurological in their effect, brain to body and body to brain in the bottom-up cascade. Then what I would do is I would get on the internet, and I would put out over the internet, I did it. Oh yes, I'm that dangerous G group that you should all be afraid of. And in fact, this is far more ubiquitous than I let on. These are only the first cases. I've let these buggies go all over the country, and your early warning signs are agitation, anxiety, worry, sleeplessness, stomach problems, heart problems. What have I done? I've rippled the sheets of the worried well. At first blush, I get every hypochondriac running to their physician, but at second and third blush, I get those individuals who begin to become worried that they may have been exposed to this, that their children may have been exposed to this, that their loved ones, their kin, their kith may have been exposed to this. Of course, the physicians, the CDC, the Public Health Service comes back and says, no, no, that's not what's going on. But I get back on the internet and I say, oh, don't you listen to that. That's fake. That's false. Your government knows what's going on. They can't do anything about it, and they can't treat you. They're going to end up quarantining you. How many people would I need to affect? We modeled it. Somewhere between 12 and 240. What would be the effect? Hang on, folks. Within 41 to 45 days, we would crash the United States public health system. Crash it. In so doing, I render the United States infrastructure vulnerable, either there or elsewhere. See the ripple effect? See the disruptive effect? I can disrupt an individual from the level of their cell to their system, and disrupt individuals on a variety of levels, from individuals all the way up to the social fabric. And that social fabric may go even further. It may be geopolitical. I need you to think just for a moment, if you could, why would it be of any value at all to affect, disrupt, and disable individuals who are U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana? When did it happen? What was happening? What would be the benefit in fracturing a growing economic, political, and social trust in that part of the world? Who would benefit? What would be the long-term effects, for example, of at least indicating that U.S. Embassy personnel and Foreign Service personnel are vulnerable to these types of threats? Could you, in fact, pair the threat with some type of conditioned stimulus? So now what you're able to do is to evoke a response in the worried well. I only offer possible suggestions for your speculation and your consideration, if you will. We can even go further. One of the newest developments is that nanoparticulate matter can be stabilized for distribution. If you're not aware of what nanoparticulate matter is, it's that matter which exists on a scale of 1 × 10⁹. Very, very small. Smaller than a cell. And we can manufacture materials that have discrete properties that can be controlled by virtue of bioengineering and their physical chemistry. To auto-aggregate, to be able to aggregate in particular areas based upon their biological and or chemical sensitivity. But now we go one step further. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, it was announced that you could then aerosolize nanomaterials. And go one step further, I can create small robotic units, controllable robotic units at the nanoscale, and that these too can be aerosolized to create a nanoswarm of biopenetrable materials that you cannot see, that can penetrate all but the most robust biochemical filters, that are able to integrate themselves through a variety of membranes, mucous membranes, and wherever, mouth, nose, ears, eyes, can be then uptaken into the vascular system to create clumping, can affect the vascular system of the brain, or can directly diffuse into the brain space, and these can be weaponized. And they can be done in such a level that their presence is almost impossible to detect, and as such, the attribution becomes exceedingly difficult to demonstrate. How much of this material would I need? Take a look. This is the front of my pen. This amount of nanomaterial, if be able to maintain and sustain with regard to its deliverability and aerosolization, could in fact affect all of you, or based upon where I come from, New York City, all yous. Look at this. Look at this. I'm carrying that material. Would you see it? Would I have to lug a giant weapon into the room? No, I wouldn't. And what if, in fact, I utilized some form of an unmanned aerial device or unmanned ground device as a delivery vehicle? Something like a drone or a bug. Could I do something with that? But let's keep going. Could I also utilize a whole host of devices to be able to affect individuals close in, for example, during interrogations, during social engagements, during human terrain team engagements, or more remotely, in a room, in a theater, in an airplane, in a bus, in a store, in a mall? The answer is increasingly yes. So this then represents for us both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that increasingly what we find is that neuroscience and technology is relatively easy to obtain. Many of the things that I've just spoken to you about are viable and obtainable directly to the consumer or directly to the scientist. We also know that many of the products that are available direct to consumer can be easily modified to create things that have a much higher weaponization potential. But more than that, we also recognize that there are dedicated efforts on the part of nation states and even groups of non-state actors and increasingly virtual nations that are using virtual currencies to fund research efforts in these areas. I'd like to think that I'm a smart guy talking to a bunch of very intelligent individuals, but let's face it, we're not the only smart people in the world. And if we're thinking this way, there are plenty of other people who are thinking this way too. Some of them are our allies, some of them may be our competitors, and some of them are combatants and hostiles. And this is, in fact, the reality. Furthermore, we recognize that the goal, particularly among the actions of the United States and her allies, is to fight for right and honor, but to keep our own honor clean, to take the moral high ground, if you will. And indeed, that has been the case in the majority of the United States engagements throughout our history. However, one of the things that may creep up here is that there's something of an abrogation, a prohibition, a proscription against engaging this type of research and its possible translation in the civilian sector. You heard earlier in the very nice introduction that Captain Bender afforded me that I've had the opportunity to work with the European Union Human Brain Project, specifically as a task leader for dual-use brain science. And one of the considerations that grew out of that was that absolutely none of those projects in the Human Brain Project, again, a multinational effort, can and should be uptaken into warfare, intelligence, and national security agenda. That's viable enough. The idea there is that these things should be used for only peaceful means. However, this also creates a challenge. And the challenge is simple. If, in fact, I choose not to train in particular ways, I choose not to train 3 days a week, if, in fact, those individuals who may choose to then conflict with me will then train in the ways that I do not and train on the days of the week that I will not, they may opportunize a select advantage. What do we do about that? Again, I think it becomes at least a problematic issue for discourse because we recognize that in many cases the civilian sector not only is not amenable to engaging in this type of research, certainly many are, but in some cases should not engage in this type of research for those very proscriptions that I had alluded to momentarily. However, the question then becomes, how do we appreciate the international challenge, risk, and threat that the advancements of the brain sciences and cognitive sciences offer for global weaponization with the brain as the next battlescape? Clearly, it defines some type of a solution space, and there have been those that have posited, myself included, that there should be more directed, more detailed, and more dedicated government efforts in this particular domain, so able to advance the brain science in ways with sustainable funding to understand what the potential risks and threats are, and to develop a stance of preparedness. This becomes increasingly important when we take a look at those countries that have notable and identified programs of high level of investment of GDP and or other levels of economic investment to advance the brain sciences in those ways that are either directly usable or have some, what I would call, explicit dual use capability. An important consideration that I want you all to bear is that current estimates based upon trend analysis is that by 2025, greater than 50% of research, development, test, evaluation, and possible use of brain sciences in general will occur outside the West. Outside the West. Furthermore, we understand that there has been a directed effort in China to be able to engage the current and future 5-year plans, to be able to advance brain science in those ways, to be able to have a higher level of gravitas with regard to the research, its capability, and its translation in medicine and other agenda, inclusive possible dual use and direct use within warfare, intelligence, and national security. This creates opportunities for research tourism, medical tourism, and market capture. And again, that market capture can be leveraged as economic warfare in terms of being able to destabilize the global market and the global economics that is relevant upon this form of bioscience and technology. But we also recognize that these things are being used for military applications. Certainly, there are directed opportunities and directed agendas for doing that within China. We also recognize that there have been activities and directed initiatives in the former Soviet Union that have now been translated and perpetuated into the current Russian infrastructure of biomedical science for military purposes. And a number of other countries have directed efforts in this space, inclusive of Iran, North Korea, India, Bolivia. Certainly among the US and its allies, we recognize that, the United States, the UK, Canada, Israel, and there are governmental efforts within Europe. We recognize also there are efforts in Japan. But there's another looming threat. The threat is the non-state actor. The threat is the virtual nation. They can establish sovereignty within a sovereignty so as to be able to say that we are immune or inured to your rules and regulations. Essentially, possibly destructive diaspora. And increasingly what we're seeing is the use of Bitcoin currencies and the like allow the finances of these types of things to be sustained in ways that were heretofore economically unimaginable, if not incapable. So as a consequence, what we're recognizing is that the threat parameters, the risk parameters, as well as the challenge and opportunity parameters are growing. We're equally concerned about the do-it-yourself community, not because this community of biohackers represents an inherently malicious or nefarious group, but because of their relative vulnerability to infiltration. And we recognize that to such an extent that at present, the Federal Bureau of Investigation in this country has dedicated ongoing efforts to try to maintain continued communication, interaction, and engagement with this community so as to be able to better surveil their relative vulnerability to purloinment, infiltration, manipulation, and misuse. Clearly, if we're looking at these things as possible destructive weapons, the more characteristic or classic criteria of drugs, bugs, and toxins meet at least some of the extant categorizations of the biological toxins, weapons, and chemical conventions. However, as disruptive agents, as those agents that may be assembled, developed anew, that do not meet these criteria, you can then get skirting of these extant treaties and these extant signatory documents, and as a consequence can develop these means, these methods, tools, and technologies essentially below the radar. Moreover, as disruptive elements, they need not be mass-produced or stockpiled, but rather their ingenuity is that they're able to be assembled in situ in relatively low quantities and used with specific effects against individuals and small groups to be able to incur disruptive effects, not only within that organism or that group of organisms, but beyond the organismic level, to the systems level, to the social level, to the geopolitical level. There's great power that can be leveraged there. Clearly, what we can do is provocative. Therefore, what we should do remains at issue. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not have answers for you, but I will pose several questions and possibilities. One of the things we have to understand is that this represents, if you will, a bioscientific speedway. Consider the true speedway. Lots of entries. I've already shown you the entries. Very fast pace. The speed of translation from concept to construct in the brain sciences is about 60 calendar months, and increasingly that's being compressed. So the developments in the brain sciences that reach a tech readiness level can be achieved within 48 calendar months. It's very fast. Certainly we know not only there are many entries, it's very fast, but the prizes are tremendous. Economic prizes, prizes of notoriety in the biomedical front, prizes of power, capability, and weaponization on the WINS front. Weaponization, intelligence, national security front. We also recognize that there are risks and possible harms, not only to those who are on the track, but to those who surround it. So the idea is, if in fact we're going to move into this space, how can we move into this space with some prudence? How do we move into this space pragmatically? And how do we move into this space in such a way that is prepared? Our group was tasked with developing these protocols and paradigms, and we referred to them as the operational neurotechnology risk assessment and mitigation paradigm. The on-ramp to the neurobiotechnological speedway, if you will. I won't bore you by reading the slide, but I do want you to pay particular attention to the lower box. That's Zig Brzezinski. In 1970, he was prescient, had forethought, foresight, and said in 1970, in the coming decades, we will see an increasing viability and value of being able to affect the neurocognitive space. There was something of the sort of crystal ball in that statement. We are there, and increasingly will be ever deepeningly there based upon not only our own initiatives, but those initiatives of groups around the country. This is a space that we need to at least be prepared for. A simple precautionary principle will no longer obtain. Why? Number one, it shouldn't. Number two, it's anachronistic. Just because we recognize that in some cases, the risks may be high and there may be certain benefits, a simple precautionary principle says if the risks or threats outweigh the benefits, don't go. However, We need to also be equally preparative and take a more advanced precautionary principle that says we must examine the potential, the probability, and the possibilities of what those risks and threats are relative to the benefits of a stance of preparedness. And preparedness very often includes engaging the research to understand how these things work and how they can be used. How do we do it? Well, these are some of the contingencies that I offer simply as proposition for you. I ask you to consider them. Number one, what is the technical rightness of any and all form of neuroscience and technology in these types of agenda? What are key situational variables that may be germane to its use or non-use? Is there evaluation or some revision of the various ethical concepts that may be able to guide these uses in practice? And might we need to develop, in some cases, new frameworks, new foundations of ethics that are more applicable, given the fact that the science and technology may be running at a speed to which our ethics and policies may not yet be apace? I'm not going to bore you with these contingencies, but what I want you to do is pretty much go down to the very, very last one. The idea here is can we utilize neuroscience and technology? And if the answer is yes, we can, should we? And if the answer there is we already are, and there are some domains and dimensions by which use should be advocated, for example, non-lethality, least harm, doing less harm than other forms of interventions and engagements that are currently in use, being able to mitigate individuals' capacity or willingness to engage in volatility. In other words, improving the capacity for individuals to gain capability to get along. Well, perhaps there's some value there. If these things are going to be used in a more hard weaponized approach, are they being used in those ways that are less harmful than other extant weapons? And/or what are the postures that we should adopt if, in fact, another nation utilizes this form of weaponology? What represents what I would consider to be comparative or appropriate proportionality? And ultimately, if, in fact, we're going to move into this space, and I think we are moving into this space realistically, not only now but ever more in the future, we have the obligation and responsibility to assess whether or not the contingencies for consent to treat our own people are in place. In other words, if there are things we're going to do to optimize the performance and capabilities of our own personnel, and if there are things that are being done on the world stage, inclusive perhaps by us and our allies, that could mitigate, affect, or manifest change in other personnel, are we prepared to accept those responsibilities? The responsibilities for ongoing research, the responsibilities for ongoing clinical care, not only of ours, but internationally, because of the role that the United States and our allies plays, and because of the need to take an upstanding moral front with regard to the fact that as we develop weapons, and as weapons are developed by us, our allies, and by others, the preparedness stance says we must also be equally assumed, equally in position to be able to not only counter those weapons, but mitigate and treat the effects that those weapons incur. And in fact, historically, very often what we've seen is that that has been the interesting march of science, technology, and medicine, where advancements in medicine very often arise as a consequence of the possible utility of various forms of science and tech to be weaponized and the damage that they incur. But the question still comes up, ladies and gentlemen, what ethics shall we use to guide research, test, development, and perhaps utilization of neuroscience and neurotechnology in these agenda and initiatives? Clearly, here in the United States, as with any open society, our military has relative transparency to the polis for our intents, our goals, and our operations. Absolutely, certain things are held confidential and classified. You don't show the other team your playbook on Friday and expect to win the game on Sunday. Yes, of course. And information we may understand about what they're doing by virtue of our deep and our intermediate surveillance may also be kept close to the chest, if you will. But the transparency of military intent operations goals and interventions here in the United States has been paramount to the nature and fabric of our infrastructure, our politics, and our government. And the same is true for our allies. So at least part of this needs to be at least relevant to, afforded by, and guided through civilian ethics. Why? Because in many cases, it is the civilian institutions that to date have been involved in at least some of the research and development that can be uptaken into dual or direct use agendas. And as such, these things are subject to, and I think validly subject to, civilian ethics of science and technology or biomedical ethics. But if we move increasingly away from that, if we say that indeed the proscriptions and prohibitions, such as those that are being proposed and leveraged by the European Union Human Brain Project and throughout the world by things like dual-use research of concern treaties, such as that which was developed at Asilomar, are taken to heart, And civilian agencies, institutions, and organizations are essentially sort of debanded, disbanded, debarred from their engagement in these types of activities. Who then will uptake the torch? Increasingly, there's been some interest, consideration, and real discussion as to reinvestment in government agencies and government-sponsored agencies that are specifically and explicitly dedicated to these pursuits. So to avoid any confusion what the intent is, and to also avoid any confusion as to who's doing what. We don't want to get another scenario, such as we do with Robert Oppenheimer looking at the first test of the atomic bomb and going, "What have I done? I am death." Dr. Oppenheimer, what did you think you were doing? We don't want to have those confusions. We want to make sure that, in fact, those who engage the brain sciences for biomedical purposes of wellness, lifestyle, and enhancing the human condition are not necessarily confused with those who may then uptake these things into WIN's agenda. But if that's the case, and these things are moving more into governmental institutions, organizations, and initiatives, are civilian ethics even viable any longer? And if we engage military ethics, what military ethical principles will we engage? The use, development, research, surveillance of these particular things for just war? And if in fact these things are not used in a strictly warfare fashion where war is declared by the use of these agents, yet they still tend to be bellicose or disruptive, can we then say that we can justify their use? In other words, not just a just war, but their just use within this frame of conduct, whatever this may be. And/or can we revive another older and less known tradition, which is called jus contra bellum, which is justification for the use to prevent warfare. Here, the use of the neurocognitive sciences and intelligence, human terrain teams, psychological operations such as narrative networks, may be viable to de-escalate the volatility and vulnerability towards violence and combativeness. But again, we need to consider to what level we will engage this and whether or not the current ethics that we have in place are viable and valuable to do this, and how these things can then be rendered on the international scale. Because if, in fact, this is going to demand the multinational global discourse that it will, then clearly the global relevance of any ethical approach needs to be considered. And ethics very often is said to have a big mouth but no teeth, but policies and international law has choppers that can, in fact, be retributive and can bite. What do these developments then incur for ongoing iterations of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, as well as other treaties, policies, and international laws that may help to guide, direct, if not regulate and govern the use of these particular implements? So the situation we're faced with, ladies and gentlemen, is as follows. As we begin to untangle the Gordian knot of the brain through the development of neuroscience and technologies, we've come to the precarious position of opening the proverbial can of worms of if, how, in what ways, to what extent, and when these techniques and technologies will be used in weaponized intelligence and national security agenda. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that can has already been opened. It'll be our job, and increasingly your job, to be able to navigate this new terrain, this brave new world, and what it incurs. This is Atlas. And the idea of Atlas was that Atlas balanced the integrity and well-being of the world upon his shoulders. I disagree. Atlas of the 21st century, as you see here, balances the world upon her head. What we know about the brain, what we're able to do with the brain, and of all those organisms that are embodied and have one that exist in their various environments, cultures, and ecologies. Because the brain sciences and its technologies confer tremendous capability of knowledge, intervention. With tremendous capability comes tremendous power. And with tremendous power comes great responsibility. Look, that phrase is good enough for Spider-Man, certainly was good enough for Goethe and Nietzsche, certainly good enough for me, and I hand that off to you. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as I started this, neuroscience puts the brain at our fingertips. Whether that's to help, to heal, or to harm, is simply the effect of the human condition and how we put this to play. You will, in your professional careers and your personal lives, see the brain sciences ever more infiltrated and integrated, not only into the battle space, but to the bedside, to the boardroom, and beyond. They will be a part of your realistic lives in the way we engage each other, regard each other, treat each other, interact, and perhaps enter into combat. Understanding the brain sciences and their power will become one of your obligate responsibilities, not only as military officers, but as civilians of the 21st century global space. I like to end a lecture like this, usually by giving you a little personal story. My dad, former Navy man, was an engineer. And one of the things Dad liked to do was build stuff. He liked to tinker. I still like to tinker. I like to work with tools. And my dad was a really bright guy. One of the things he did when I was a kid, he'd come home every month and bring me a new tool, teach me how to use it. So that in fairly short order, as a young kid, I became pretty adroit, or at least I thought I was adroit, with using tools. And with all of the impulsiveness and zeal of youth, getting a new tool with only partial knowledge, I remember one day Dad came home and he said to me, "Jim, here's a brand new tool." And I took it from him. I said, "Thanks, Dad," and I went to go running off. My dad put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Jim, slow down. Measure twice. Cut once. Sometimes you can't go back." Ladies and gentlemen, these are the brain sciences. They can and they will increasingly be used in national security, intelligence, and defense agenda globally. We need to measure twice and cut once, and make sure that the cut that we make is one that is for good, one that is for right, and is one that does not cut our own throats or the throats of others in those ways that are irreparable. I leave you with my father's wisdom. These are some of our white papers that we've submitted to the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon. I can make these slides available to you. These are now all open domain and available to your perusal. If you're interested in some of our ongoing work by my research group, I provide you with some of our own work. And this is the part of the lecture, I'm going to look right at the camera, that is the unabashed self-promotional plug. If you're really interested in this, I've only had the wonder and opportunity to engage with you for about the past hour or so. If you're interested in going further down the rabbit hole and reading about this in greater detail, granularity, and specificity, I recommend this to you. Not because I'm going to go out and buy the new Maserati when you all buy the book, but because I'm very proud of it. And I'm proud of it not because I wrote it, because I only really contributed a couple of chapters. I'm proud of it because bringing this together was a multi-year effort that grew out of a set of, at first, somewhat sensitive but unclassified and some classified conferences that we had that were then subsequently declassified, and then also brought together international leaders in the field of military science, bioengineering, neuroscience, philosophy, ethics, and law to provide their perspective, their lens, their vision and voice as to what's going on in this domain at this point, with some speculation, vision, and proposition as to what may need to go on in the future, so he's able to opportunize the capabilities of the brain sciences and meet and be prepared for the challenges that it offers in this space. At this point, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I hope I haven't bored you. If you wish to get in touch with me, feel free. Just put in your subject line USMA, so I don't think you're trying to sell me Viagra. Not that I wouldn't buy it, but this way I know where it's coming from. If you want to ask questions, you have some time to do that now. If you don't get to your questions, feel free to email me. I will email you back. It may not be that day or even that week because I may be busy or traveling, but I will, in fact, email you back because that's my obligate responsibility to you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. Appreciate it.
If you guys have any questions, we have about 5-10 minutes.
Yes, sir.
It's not really a military question. I'm just curious what you think of Michael Pollan's new book and the role of psychedelics in society.
Oh, yeah. Well, so there have been a number of different books. So the new book there is that the idea psychedelic drugs had some bad research, and of course some of that bad research was not only procedurally bad, it was based upon the font of knowledge we had at the time. Having engaged in psychedelic research, having engaged in psychedelic research, one of my first projects actually was looking at methylene dioxymethamphetamine ecstasy under a United States Navy grant for the possibility of weaponizing ecstasy as a volatile agent, as a viable agent, particularly against submariners. So the understanding that the psychedelics could in fact be used in a variety of different ways, inclusive of weaponization, is not new. We look back to the older projects such as MK Ultra, Mind Control Ultra, which utilized lysergic acid diethylamide and psilocybin to be able to alter the cognitions, emotions, and behaviors of individuals to see if that could be leveraged not only against our own people, but against others, sort of the whole brainwashing, mind-changing effect. However, one of the things we've come to recognize is that the mechanisms of these psychedelic agents is far more specific than we thought, and in fact, can be incurred at far lower doses than were heretofore attempted either experimentally or in social practice. So there's a regenerated interest, a revivified interest in re-examining the mechanisms and effect of these psychedelic compounds, inclusive of lysergic acid diethylamide, psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, as well as some that are sort of like borderline on what might be considered a psychedelic, such as the affiliative drugs like MDMA, at microdoses or sort of intermediate microdoses not only to treat individuals who've had particularly neuropsychiatric spectrum disorders, and there's a growing body of research that would suggest that even one-time administration of a therapeutic dose of LSD or psilocybin and/or MDMA may have very profound therapeutic effects against certain forms of PTSD, intractable depression, and beyond the military framework, even certain forms of psychosis. We also recognize that these things may be useful in treating forms of TBI, treating other forms of psychiatric and neuropsychiatric disorders, and may also be viable as performance enhancers, particularly if given in a very specific regimen at a very controlled dosimetry. So to think like so many other things, the more we're learning about the brain suggests to us not only what we know, but what we didn't know, some of the errors in our previous ways of experimentation and empiricism, and that allows us to revisit these things under a newer and I think more granular perspective that I think may demonstrate certain benefits, as well as giving rise to concern about certain burdens and risks. So I think that it certainly warrants continued research, and I think that we need to be cautious in how we interpret that research and its translational effect, but I think there's great benefit to be gained there. Did I answer your question? Other questions? Yes, sir.
So I had a similar question. So in regards to the enablement of the warfighter or intel operator, do you think one day the military will change its stance towards legalizing the use of pharmaceuticals or nootropics such as modafinil or Adderall to...
Yes. Yes. In fact, I can tell you some ongoing research that's being done now by the Air Force Research Laboratory that's looking not only at the comparative use of what's called nootropic agents, as you said, modafinil and some of the newer ones. They've been around for a while, but they're sort of new with regard to the light of their potential utility. Some of those drugs like as piracetam, pramiracetam, oxiracetam, these have been around for a long time, but now we're understanding their mechanisms a little bit better, and we're recognizing how we may be able to use them in concert with other agents, inclusive of something like caffeine, and or how we can also utilize these agents at lower doses that are much more safer dose that can also then be co-potentiated through the use of various devices. Here, we're talking about the transcranial devices such as transcranial magnetic stimulation and transcranial electrical stimulation. And if you're interested in some of this work, I refer you to a colleague of mine who's at Air Force. He's a Wright Pat, and his name is Andy McKinley. Just look up some of Dr. McKinley's work in this area. It's stellar. It's leading edge. And the Air Force Office of Scientific Research is funding a number of different projects that are looking at exactly this mechanism. Can we engage certain brain substrates, nodes, and networks through the use of new pharmaceuticals or older pharmaceuticals that are redosed or pharmaceutically delivered in different ways to be able to maximize key aspects of the processes of those neural functions that are operative in key tasks for the intelligence operator or warfighter? And in so doing, can we then take a slightly different stance on our postures towards the viability and value of these drugs under controlled circumstances for the warfighter or intelligence operator? And I think that's the general idea. Okay? Did I answer your question? Cool. Other questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you all.
James Giordano here today from Georgetown University. He is a professor. I have to read this because it's a lot. He's a professor in the development of neurobiology and biochemistry. He's a chief of neuroethics studies program and the co-director of the O'Neill Pellegrino program in brain science and the global health law and policy at Georgetown University. He served on the joint staff of the Pentagon, and in this area he heads up the EU Human Brain Project. He's going to talk a little bit about that today. He's tasked with his work is dedicated to the studying and defining of current and political dual-use capabilities in neuroscience and neurotechnology. It's an extremely in-depth discussion. I encourage you guys to ask questions at the end. His area is, his expertise is in brain science and can be developed and engaged in military applications, warfare applications, bioweapons, both by state and non-state actors. So I'm going to head it over to Jim.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's my second or third time being out at Livermore. I've been working for a while with Zach, and that's been a real pleasure. And of course, my ongoing work with Paris and company. As Paris mentioned, one of the things that I do is I do brain science, and I've worked in the area of translational brain science, which is bringing brain science from the research bench to the bedside for about the past 32 years. So I've been doing this for a while. Brain science, as you may know, has also had a fairly rapid development and trajectory of its capabilities, moving from fairly simple approaches to studying the brain to far more complicated approaches that I'll talk to you about today. But like with so many other areas of science and technology, the capability that is conferred by the science, that is the knowledge, and its techniques and its technology, therefore its tools, giving us implements, to affect in some way a biological system, renders it relatively powerful to do a whole host of things. Now, as Paris mentioned, of course, I also work as the chief of an ethics center at Georgetown. I'm working within the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics. And what I do is an area called neuroethics, a relatively new field, but not per se. The idea is that the title of neuroethics has only been around since about 2002 in formal use. But the idea of understanding the ethics, legal, and social issues and regulatory issues that arise from any science and technology are quite old. What makes neuroethics a bit more interesting and perhaps unique is that the thing that we use as the focus of our study, the brain and those techniques and technologies that go into studying the brain and in some ways affecting the brain, remain relatively unknown to us. I don't care how you twist this. There's really none of us in this room, and I've been a brain scientist for over 3 decades, who could tell you how the great stuff of cognition, emotion, and even behavior arise in and from that gray stuff of those squirting, squirting cells that exist in your head. We don't know that. If I were going to be Aristotelian for a moment and sort of wax philosophically, what I could tell, you enjoyed it, that's good. So I always look for the philosopher in the crowd who gets the Aristotelian gig. The issue is very simple. We don't understand what's called the efficient cause of what the brain does. We know how it works as a basic biological system. We might even speculate, and very realistically, why it's important to a biological system. But do we know how the brain makes, quote, mind? No, we don't. Yet, that doesn't stop us, because there's something called the mechanistic paradox, which is although we need to understand the mechanism of how and why something works, we also fall victim to the fact that very often we use what's called satisficing information. In other words, good enough for government work, and we'll just proceed on smartly. Moreover, what that also does is raises the intersection of a host of unknowns. If we don't know how the thing that we're affecting works, well, the beauty of it is the tools that we develop help us to understand that. But then we have to revise what we think are the key issues that come from our tool use on that thing. This is not what's called reductio ad absurdum. This is not reductive thinking. It's real. That said, let me take you on a little trip in time into brain sciences, what they really do. Let me move this down here because I'm so short you can't see me over the bottle of water. So this slide, I think, very nicely demonstrates for you a relative 100-year history of the brain sciences, going back to an anatomical diagram that was pioneered right after the advent of anesthesia in the middle of the 1800s to be able to allow direct access to the living brain neurosurgically. Now, what that allowed us to do is to manipulate the structure of the brain, and as a consequence of that, see what artifacts occurred with regard to individuals' thought, emotionality, and behaviors. Of course, we all know the prototypic example being Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who got a tamping iron through his frontal lobes, and as a consequence of that, survived, but as the adage says, Phineas was Phineas no more. So the issue here is that there's something ticking away within your cranium that makes you, you. That renders the brain sciences exceedingly important, not anymore perhaps in certain ways than other areas of the biomedical sciences, but in ways that are both practical and philosophical. In other words, if I'm able to in some way assess and affect this thing that is in at least some way demonstrably and perhaps to a large extent responsible for making you, you, your persona, your thoughts, your hopes, your dreams, well, look at the power that that can yield. We like to talk about influencing hearts and minds, but this is a question of influencing brains to influence hearts to then influence minds. Continue to look at the slide, because what you see is the interesting dance that essentially technology has allowed the brain sciences to advance with. We've gone from these rather rudimentary examples of utilizing these techniques of surgery during the beginning of the last century, the 1900s, to being able to utilize ever more sophisticated anatomical and molecular probes to understand the brain at a variety of ever more nuanced and granular levels, and ultimately to not even have to intervene with the actual structure of the brain, but to be able to assess the brain in real time, utilizing convergent forms of neuroimaging coupled to a host of neuroelectrophysiological techniques. This has been very, very important, because what this allows us to do is essentially something akin to this, both literally and metaphorically, which is to essentially put the brain at our fingertips. This is my brain. I take it out nightly and floss it. With my haircut, it makes it rather easy. But there is something I want you to also understand about this. If you were to do exactly as I'm doing here in this slide, which would be to put your brain in front of you, first of all, the mere size of it, I think, is somewhat interesting to people. We tend to think it's a lot larger. It's not. It fits in the palm of your hands. But now let's wax a little more philosophical but very practical with that same analogy. If this is something that fits in the palm of your hand, every hope, every dream, every thought, every aspiration, everything you love, everything you hate, fits in that organ. And if I really wanted to wax philosophical, everything that humanity has ever done and will be is a consequence of that organ's function. Once again, we're talking about power. But let me tell you a little neuroanatomical and neuroscientific adage. We have a saying in the brain sciences, see one brain, see one brain. Which means that despite the fact that if I pulled my brain out of my head and his brain out of his and her brain out of hers, it would basically look like that with regard to its gross architecture. The devils and deities lie in the details. Our brains develop as a consequence of their embodiment in me and you, and as a consequence of the environments we work in. Which means that what the brain sciences are helping to do is to figure out both what brains have in common and what brains have in difference. Now, the beauty of that is, through the iterative use of big data, what we're able to do is to create large-scale patterns, maps, atlases of not only individual brains, but groups of brains, and use these things comparatively and normatively. The more we know, the bolder we go. Puts the brain at our fingertips. But what you want to see is that the brain sciences have, in fact, created a tremendous amount of momentum and potential. And that is the momentum to be able to assess, access, and affect. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What it really does is it creates an opportunity to affect the way humans think, feel, and behave on a variety of levels. And those levels don't only extend within the individual organism, in other words, being able to affect thought, emotion, behavior with regard to ranging all the way from the synaptic to our social interactions individually, but it also allows us to then exert certain levels of intellectual assessment, knowledge acquisition, and control about human relations on the individual to cohort to group to community to local, regional, even global scale. And obviously, we can, in fact, use that information and arguably the capacity to be able to not just use the information, but to actually physically affect the brain through these techniques and tools in ways that are important to, meaningful for, and highly leverageable within national security, intelligence, and defense agenda. This is no different than other forms of science and technology. Arguably, one could say that the individual with the most sophisticated science and technology has always looked to bring those into those agendas to defend kin and kith, to be able to advance an ideology, to be able to defend those things we hold dear. History teaches us that. The latest and greatest tools are very often incorporated into these large-scale agenda, particularly by mechanized and technological countries. We've seen this historically throughout the ages, this being no different. So the idea that what we're able to say is that the leverageability of the brain sciences extends from the synaptic to the social, and from the individual to the global, is not just a lot of fancy rhetoric. It is, in fact, real and realizable. Moreover, in utilizing the brain sciences in these ways, I think it becomes important to understand a formal definition of a term that I will use repeatedly throughout this lecture. This term, a weapon. As directly cited from the Oxford English Dictionary, there are two interactive and I think important definitions of a weapon you need to understand. The first is as a means of contending against another. We hear this colloquially, someone who has a great sense of humor, so, oh, their sense of humor is a real weapon. In other words, they can use it well to interact with others positively and in some cases derisively. The old sort of film noir movies where it showed the sultry woman sitting in the bar and she'd show some leg and be like, those gams are a weapon. Those kind of things. Yeah, it's a means of contending against another. For those of you who are far younger than I, gams is a slang for legs. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a derogative or denigrative way. It is a way of contending against another. I can use humor as a weapon to disarm someone. I can use affability as a weapon to make what may have been a potential foe or hostile my friend. But I think the way that we use the word weapon more colloquially is the one that comes to mind and should not be ignored in this context, which is this, something that can be used to injure, defeat, and or destroy another, a potential enemy. Put them both together, you have this wonderful 25-buck definition, and I usually impugn anyone who reads off a PowerPoint slide, but I just want to reinforce the definition. Something that mitigates aggression and fosters thoughts and feelings of affiliation or passivity. Oh, in other words, if I make my enemy my friend, not my enemy any longer, that's still weaponizable. And or something that incurs burdens of morbidity and or mortality. The idea of this is something not only used to influence and deter, but actually to, in some way, mitigate or prevent an individual from exercising those actions towards me and mine. If we look at weapons and we were to trace these historically, I think Ruddington provides a very, very good overview of the history of weapons. There are a number of different books that could provide this for you. Everything from somebody picking up a rock and using it a la 2001: A Space Odyssey, all the way up to the contemporary use of very, very sophisticated forms in S&T. What we see is as the momentum of S&T increases, the weaponizability of that science and technology in a variety of realms also increases. It used to be that I need to be exceedingly close to someone to now influence them with a weapon, and now what we see is we create both distal potential as well as much more capable potential to affect them in a variety of different ways, ranging from the sublime all the way up to the severe. So we know this to exist. There are two types of weapons, those that are called soft weapons and those that are called hard weapons. If we now take a look at the brain sciences as weaponizable, a real word by the way, we can see that in fact the brain sciences are weaponizable across both dimensions: soft weaponizability and hard weaponizability. In the former sense, we're seeing that the neurosciences can be used to gain economic leverage, not least of which is because neuroscience and technology commands and captures $175 billion with a B dollar annual market space. There's a tremendous amount of global economic leverage that can be occurred and affected, but can also be used for somewhat softer applications in the national security space, inclusive of intelligence purposes and the use of neuro and cognitive sciences to develop insights to and techniques for psychological operations and information systems, what is referred to in military parlance as PSYOPs and MESO. If we now transition that into more hard forms of weaponizability, these are the areas where we're actually looking to exert physical, not just cognitive influence and or deterrence. These are your more classical forms of weaponization where you actually see things like guns, bullets, bombs, etc. But now, when confined to the biological space, we see chemicals such as drugs and other chemical agents, biological such as the use of various microbes, both bacteria and viruses and toxins, and increasingly devices, which up until quite recently were not even considered to be in the weaponizable space, and only very recently, with regard to the last review conference of the International Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention last December, did the Australia group raise the possibility that certain devices, namely neurotechnology and hybrid cyborg-type devices, which we'll talk about, should be considered within the larger scale of what might be a potential biological. So what we're seeing is we need to cast a broader net as we increase broader and ever more sophisticated capabilities. Still with me? Okay. In fact, what we're doing here is just this. We're targeting the brain. And we're targeting the brain on a variety of levels. Now, like any good target, what I have to be able to do is I need to put the pipper on point. In other words, I need to put this gun sight, so to speak, where I want it to be. Otherwise, what I'm doing is I'm just hosing a target indiscriminately. That's not what I look to do. I don't want buckshot. I want sharp shot. So the first thing that I need to do, as anyone will tell you, is I have to recon my target area quite well so as to be able to acquire viable targets and also to avoid collateral damage. The assessment neurotechnologies do a very good job in doing that with increasing sophistication. They're not used individually. They're used in a way that's called co-registered. I can use forms of neuroimaging, and these are diverse. They run the gamut from the older forms, such as things like computerized tomography and single photon emission tomography, to the much newer forms that utilize a highly specific electromagnetic pulse signal, not only to be able to image certain brain areas, but also to image tracts, communicating networks and nodes within the brain in a directional way in rather rapid time. I can utilize neurophysiological recordings such as electroencephalography, and I've dialed in the specificity of that as well through the use of quantitative techniques. I can also look at neurogenomics and neurogenetics, taking a look at genetic profiles of individuals and groups to be able to determine what genes may be in fact coding for certain structures and functions of the brain. I can utilize proteomics and other forms of biomarkers, and I can utilize neurocyber-informatics. In other words, I can harness all of these forms of assessments to a big data approach that allow me to make both comparatives and normative indices, not only within an individual, but between individuals, not only between individuals, but within and between groups on a variety of scales. So the idea of assessment technology, in many ways, combines each and all of these, and the combinatory power of that is facilitated and fortified through the use of big data. We've written comprehensively about the use of big data as a force multiplier in neuroscience and neuroweaponology, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to provide that to you. But the idea here is, like so many other forms of recon and evaluation and assessment, we as humans tend not to turn rocks over just to look what's underside. We turn rocks over so we can use what's under there. The brain is no different. If what I'm doing is I'm trying to put a pipper on target and make sure it's square on point, I want to do something with that. This is not just a let's go see mission. This is a let's go see so that ultimately we can translate this into some viable effect, either of the knowledge or to actually target these things through the use of some technique or technology. Now what we're looking at is the interventional techniques. Do not ignore cyber, because power comes from knowledge and information. And if I understand how a brain works and how neurocognitive mechanisms are operative and the various impressions we then gain in our thoughts, emotions that may ultimately feed into behaviors, I can manipulate the type of information and its delivery so as to be able to influence brain state. This is part of the incentive and underlying rationale and methods that were employed in a DARPA program called Narrative Networks that was led by a colleague of mine, Dr. William Casebeer. Exactly at doing that. The more we know about the way a brain works, the more we can utilize said information to develop key narratives of psychological and meso operations that are then viable to be able to then be used to influence individual and group brains. We've done this for a long time. This is also referred to incidentally as neuromarketing. And ordinarily, I just kind of shy away from that neuro prefix because people tend to use it literally nonsensically. And in fact, a quick homework assignment for those of you who are students in the room. I never lose my professorial demeanor. For those of you who are students in the room, after the lecture today, sometime maybe over the week or weekend, just go to a magazine store, a bookstore, and pull out a few magazines. They don't even have to be science magazine. They can be like fitness magazines, Wine Spectator, Whiskey Advocate. My God, I sound like an alcoholic. Whiskey Advocate, Shape, Vanity Fair. I guarantee you that there's going to be some discussion there with a picture of a neuroimage that says, this is your brain, fill in the blank. Drinking beer. This is your brain in love. This is your brain after a breakup. We like to use the brain sciences to sort of import this type of information. And moreover, the idea that we're able to utilize this in a way to understand how brains work to influence various marketing stratagems is becoming ever more the norm. I have a colleague of mine who makes big six figures working for a marketing firm to be able to intuit these types of studies, bringing people into a scanner and seeing what they respond to, and then developing verbiage and image to be able to do just that. That narrative extends beyond the commercial space, also extends into the defense space. And I refer you to a group of reports that we've been putting out over the past few years through the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group that's headed by a fellow named Doc Kabayan at the Pentagon that looks exactly at that, the neurocognitive dynamics of deterrence. This is still somewhat soft. We still tend to rely more and more on the older forms of get in there and do the job. And now what we're looking at basically are things like drugs, bugs, toxins, and devices. One more time, drugs, bugs, toxins, and devices. Each and all of these being capabilized by ever more sophisticated, ever more advanced, and iteratively more capable doable forms of neuroscience and technology. We'll talk about each of these in some detail. What we're able to do with these is not only develop better drugs, but more specific drugs. I had the opportunity and the pleasure to interact with some from the research groups here this morning who are working in the area of nanopharmacology. The idea of harnessing nanoscience to be able to make the drugs more penetrable, more accessible, and more selective in their capability to do just this. Target key brain sites and networks that have shown to be operative and functional in certain forms of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Moreover, to be able to develop new forms of biologicals, not necessarily that are lethal, but that are morbid. And one of the more successful approaches to doing this is through utilizations of genetic modification of these microbes so as to take those microbes that were relatively benign and make them somewhat more morbid in their profile, make them more virulent, or to allow them to be more capable over a longer period of time so that they can be used against various individuals and populations with a greater level of efficiency. We can also develop new forms of neurotoxins, and since neurotoxins for the most part are peptides, they degrade fairly rapidly. But here too, forms of genetic modification, forms of nanomicellar encapsulation and delivery can allow these to become newly available and newly more potent and viable for the use in the weapon space. And once again, we're now exhibiting a new horizon of possibility, which is the neurotechnological device space. Each and all of these, what I should let you understand, is engaged by this particular process, which is a real term, integrative scientific convergence. It is a term that a colleague of mine, formerly at the State Department, named Dr. Ashok Vashasta, has been working very, very closely to advance and understand, and it's essentially represented by this neat little cartoon. It's a de-siloing of the capability space. It's also a de-siloing of the opportunity space, both for problems and problem resolution and problem generation yet again. In the past, when I grew up in science, as many of you have grown up in science doing, for those who are sort of more of my generation, you recognize you had fairly discrete silos of disciplinary operation. Those of us in chemistry who talked to those of us in biology, and there was some crosstalk, cross-fertilization, but very often they occurred at the top and the bottom of the silo. Things that occurred within the silo occurred within the silo. Sort of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens in your department stays in your department. More and more, however, we're moving towards this conjoinment model that de-silos the operation and opportunity space and allows for a much more convergent engagement of what the brain sciences can do. And in fact, for those of you working in the brain sciences, you recognize that there's a relatively sort of fluid dynamic that occurs between physics and chemistry, chemistry and biology, biology and behavioral science, and undergirding and perhaps overseeing all of these are both engineering models and computational models. These have been capabilized by this. So it allows us to conjoin cyber science and tech, the anthro and social sciences, natural sciences, biotechnology, and nanoscience and technology in a large integrative model that increases the viability, validity, and ultimately perhaps value of what the brain sciences can achieve in a fairly short period of time. And in national security, intelligence, and defense agendas more and more, this type of convergent approach is being harnessed upon assessment, access, and targeting of neurological structure and function so as to be able to get a better insight to and influence of individuals and groups on a whole host of levels. One of the things that makes this work, as I alluded to earlier, is the use of large-scale data banking and data utilization, what's referred to as big data. Not to belabor the point to excess or in extremis, understand it is used as a force multiplier. In other words, it takes the forces that are there and it multiplies both their capability and ultimately their value and utility as a consequence of being able to utilize large volume data banks, which then are able to engage, assimilate, synthesize, and pull down in real time individual cohort and populational data tiers, and in so doing allow multiple tier integration, multimodal, multi-level, and then also allow real-time access requirements that can be utilized in practice. In other words, we can use these large-scale data integrators to be able to pull information about him and her and him in a comparative way, in a normative way, and also in a way that allows us to then develop various tools to be able to understand how better to access him and her and him, and all of, as you can tell from my New York accent, use. Now, this has to be scalable in many cases. Check, it is. It has to be customizable. We're still working on that one. It has to be accessible, clearly, because multiple user groups, shareholders and stakeholders have to get to it. And it has to be shareable. There are some issues that go along with that. And for those of you working in the neuroengineering space, this has been a long-standing issue, I would say in some cases, problem, with regard to developing the right types of big data tools and techniques, specifically for large-scale integrative projects, such as those that are being funded by DARPA, subnets, systems-based neurotechnology for emerging therapies, RAM, restoring active memory, haptics, et cetera. Multi levels of different types of data coming from different types of engineering and science that have to be pulled together to make a cogent picture. But we're doing that. We're moving in those directions. And in some cases, you also want to anonymize or de-anonymize these data, and there are some security issues that you would imagine go along with that. But the other issue that goes along with this is that at least on the research to translation side of the house, you see these increasing needs for what we call security. And I mean real security. You want these things to be secure in terms of their use because I'm providing a lot of information about the you-ness of you. Perhaps your lifelong history, your medical records, things about your brain, what they infer. And the nature of these systems is that you have to stack different types of data platforms and use platforms. And although I am not particularly a cyber technology mogul, my colleagues who are tell me that if something is stackable, it's hackable. I tell you from my own experience, what I am is a longtime judo player and wrestler, and I know if you want to knock somebody down, even the biggest guy goes down at their weak points, and that's their joints. And this is no different. And so the issue here is, yes, we need this tool. We're developing this tool. We see the viability and value of this tool. But we also recognize the vulnerability of this tool, as do others. Key point. Which means that as we're beginning to look at the potential weaponization, weaponizability of neuroscience, we also have to recognize the vulnerability of the tools we're developing to make it work. Those are not only our own vulnerabilities, but those are the vulnerabilities of those other groups that may be engaged in this. But now let's move a little bit more into the more direct applications of viable neuroscience and technology with regard to battlescape use, battlescape applications. I've given lectures over the past couple of years and written chapters that have directly attributed the brain as the next battlescape, and I truly believe that, as do a number of my other colleagues. I'm not alone in that belief. The idea of developing a much more punctate and much more clear definition of what dual use constitutes and recognizing that this is in fact a very usable domain of the brain sciences, I think is a reality we must face. So much so that let me give you a little bit of history as an aside, not to bore you. In 2008, a convening group of the National Academies of Science created a special commission, a task force, to take a look at the viable military use of the brain sciences. In 2008, they said, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but it ain't ready for prime time yet. 2008. In the interim, there was an ongoing study being conducted in Europe by the Nuffield Council of Bioethics that devoted a specific chapter to the weaponizability and dual use potential of brain sciences and said, you know, we're getting very close. And they estimated that within about a year or two, this would in fact be translatable and ready for prime time. In the United States, the same convening panel of the National Academies reconvened, and in 2014 wrote a second report that said, yes, indeed, the brain sciences have matured to a point not only where they are ready for primetime national security, intelligence, and defense applications, but are currently being investigated and in some cases are being used in such endeavors, not only domestically but worldwide. 2008 to 2014, what happened? I'll tell you what happened. It reflected the transitional pace of progress in the brain sciences, which has gone from between 15 and 20 years down to a translational space of about 60 to 72 calendar months. In 5-year windows of opportunity, the brain sciences are able to make ardent strides, and as a consequence of that, are now moving rapidly for their consideration into this operationalizable space, ever more. What I caution against very strongly is two things. Number one, crying wolf, and number two, what we call chicken little phenomenon. The first is wolf, 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 and there's no wolf there. So finally, when there is a wolf there, we're caught with our knickers down around our knees. And the second is the chicken little phenomenon. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. That's exaggerative claims. That does nobody any good, and it wastes resources. This is not crying wolf, and this is not chicken little. There's a wolf there. And although it may not be that the sky is falling yet, folks, it looks like rain. Bring an umbrella. That said, what's going to rain down? This. Various uses of neuroscience and technology in intelligence, security, and defense operations. So for example, if we take a look at the intelligence and surveillance space, our group has been very focused upon the capability of something called NeurInt, neurocognitive intelligence, which really represents not only assessing various neuropsychological factors that are operative in narratives of individual and group activities and the cognitions that underscore them, but also harnessing intelligence operators to brain-machine interfacing systems so as to allow an increased capability through reciprocal dynamic robotics, whereby the system is doing certain things quite well, the human operator is doing things quite well, and they reciprocally learn from each other. Demonstrated shifts in performance curves to the left, in other words, improvement in capability, has been demonstrated through some of these techniques. And the use of large-scale databasing that's able to present and engender certain patterns of salience to pull signal from noise has been very helpful in this. Is this a work in progress? Yes, absolutely. Is it in progress? Very absolutely. Moreover, we can utilize various types of brain assessment and access approaches for forms of biotracking, getting what's called neurological signatures or brain signatures on key individuals that then may be representative of whole groups. This feeds back to what we discussed earlier, the neural narratives. If I understand how his brain works and how her brain works, and I'm able to do that on a broad enough scale, I can develop patterns, and as a result, I may be able to use that in ways that inform my intelligence. It synergizes and force multiplies my human intelligence, humint, my signal intelligence, sigint, and my communications intelligence, comment. Neurint, coupled with assessment and access, gives me said capabilities. But I can also begin to utilize this for intelligence acquisition in different ways. I can, for example, utilize neuropharmacologics and various forms of brain stimulation to be able to extract information from key intelligence targets in ways that are far less deleterious and or harmful to said targets, and as a result, uphold a higher, if you will, moral conduct in the face of various forms of intelligence operations. Now that I've said that, I should tell you that this is not without argument, because there are those that think, wait a minute. The last sanctified space is that of my consciousness, and you're using this stuff to invade that? You're right. There's an ethical argument there. Is this more or less harmful than other means of information extraction? Well, I mean, clearly, I think this is not only a debatable point, but an importantly debatable point, which forces us to essentially set parameters and limits and ask not only can we use this, the answer is yes, should we use this? And if the answer there appears to be yes, then the far more granular, specific, and ever more important question is really how, when, under what circumstances? I'll keep you poised in excitement and anticipation on the ends of your seat for the answer to that, which comes later in this lecture. For those of you watching on video, stand by. So what we understand is this possible? Yes, it is. In fact, it came up in our discussions this morning. Might it be possible to utilize these techniques and technologies for information acquisition, particularly in those ways that are going to be far more efficient without incurring, quote, burdens and harms on those who are interrogating? And what are the scenarios into which they could be used? Again, the short answer to the question is yes. The long answer to the question is how, when, why? These are percolating, and certainly I don't think there's a necessarily definitive answer, although there seems to be at least an ethical posture that may be useful in trying to adjudicate the approach. Moreover, we can also utilize something called TITAN, which is Tiered Integrative Tracking and Access Networks that utilize biologically implantable chips to then track key individuals in a variety of circumstances and then yoke these to known information about the way brains work to create narratives and behaviors. And essentially what this does is this adds to what's called human terrain teaming. This feeds back to an older idea called naked man approaching. In other words, I don't need to identify you by your uniform, by your clothes, but perhaps by certain anthropometric characteristics, and in this case, biological signatures. So the idea of indwelling biosensors that are able to then upload remotely telemetrized, see, this is what happens when the coffee wears up. Telemetrized information is quite real. Those of you working in the area of biosensors, RFIDs, understand the potential power here. This is a key area for dual use because these types of sensors are being developed for populational monitoring of key biological variables that can be then uptaken into health information databases. The same type of thing can be used for other forms of information, not least of which is tracking and identification. The idea to then be able to take a key individual set of biological metrics and immediately in real time pull them into a large-scale data analytic to say, this is who this person is, and this is where this person's been, and this is who this person's been interacting with, could be very, very useful. It also obviously opens the specter. It clearly opens a Pandora's box of potential neuroethical, legal, and social issues. Once again, it refers to the context of use and how we define what is good, not only what is right and capable. We can also utilize neuroscience and technology to augment the capability of potential warfighters, not just intelligence operators. This sort of gets into some of the discourse that had been bantered around previously in the field with regard to, quote, super soldiers, and what we're able to do with regard to capabilizing functions of the brain to then increase our cognition, our emotions, and our behaviors in a variety of warfighting type tasks. Can you do this? Well, this is the area of neuroenablement. Yes, of course you can, within certain parameters. And like so many other things, it's less than ideal and less than complete. But can we target key neurological substrates, change the function of those substrates, and in so doing, approach various trajectories of improving individuals' cognitive skills on key tasks, emotional capabilities in the key circumstances, and behaviors and actions and key performance parameters? Yes, we can. Are there limits? Are there constraints? Yes, absolutely. How can we do this? Well, I think one of the easiest ways, although not necessarily the most effective, is through the use of advanced neuropharmacological agents. And there are a host of them. Certainly, we hear a lot of the discourse about performance-enhancing drugs, not only in terms of the military, but for a variety of other uses, inclusive the civilian side of the house, where people are looking to take a variety of drugs, stimulants, eugeroics, vigilants, anti-sedative drugs, to be able to then increase their capability to study, to function, to be better at work, cognitive enhancers. Could these be used within military and security intelligence frameworks? Yes, absolutely we could. Could we also use computational brain-machine interfacing? Without a doubt. Could we use closed and open-loop brain stimulation approaches, not necessarily through the use of indwelling devices, such as implants, but also perhaps through the use of non-invasive brain stimulation, such as transcranial magnetic and electrical stimulation? The answer appears to be yes. The short answer. The long answer is that it is exceedingly context-dependent. It's based upon brain state, based upon task, and we have to define what exact parameters of performance we're looking to affect, and what changing the function of nerve and brain does to change the relative outcomes with regard to these performances. But that doesn't mean we can't do it. The question is, should we and how? The same is true with regard to neurosensory augmentation. Here I'll speak very specifically to some of the programs you have ongoing. There have been some bioengineering programs here at this laboratory that has looked at the capability to increase visual acumen, if not restore sight, to individuals who've lost their sight. Increase capability to create second and third generation cochlear and auditory implants. These are not limited to the usual range of the human sensorium, but can in fact be used to get increased focus, what's sometimes referred to as eagle eye, or sometimes referred to as bat's ear. So the ability to then extend the sensorium and modify human capability outside what falls within the Gaussian distribution of what is human clearly is capable here, and may be paired to other forms of neurological intervention to create open and closed loop brain systems to really expand not only the capacity of the human system within its functional range, but to go beyond that and now have something called exceptional modification. No sci-fi here, folks, only facts. Then we get into the real form of a weapon. And we're talking about a real form of a weapon. Remember, this is a means of contending against another in each and all of these dimensions. Assess and predict their escalations to violence so that we may be able to intervene, perhaps mitigate those, mitigate said aggression directly or indirectly, incur certain burdens of morbidity that makes them less likely to engage in combative or violent activity, and in some cases, induce mortality. These are all viable operational definitions of a weapon, and can neuroscience and technology be employed for these? Each and all. One of the areas where we're looking to refine the capabilities of neuroscience and technology is something referred to as non-lethal or less lethal weapons. And while one might think that the ethical argument strongly supports these directions, here too, there is in fact a strong discourse that pushes back against any potential military warfare applications of the brain sciences that I think you need to understand. The reason I bring that up is that this can do two things. Number one, it creates a posture where the neurosciences cannot and should not ever be used for these types of operations. Please understand, my feeling on that is, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? If we could in fact look ourselves in our eye as humanity and say we shall never employ science and technology for those means that may be destructive against others, irrespective of whether or not those individuals are aligned with our ideology and our beliefs. Yes, that would be. The reality of the situation poses itself as something quite differently, however. And the problem we need to face is that certain prohibitions, if not frank proscriptions against using brain science in these potential ways, even defensively, may create an opportunistic window for others to be able to then pursue these approaches more vigilantly and more aggressively. It's a balancing act, folks. I'm not going to necessarily tell you how to resolve it because I don't know, and it becomes difficult. There are certain things we can do on the research side of the house to dial back who does the research, what type of research is done, and what it's used for. But this is a cat that's already out of the bag, and as I hope to demonstrate to you in a moment, this is being conducted on an international scale, and so it may be a little late to start thinking about we're never going to use it like this and what happens if we do or we don't. What types of kind of neural weapons can we engage and develop? Well, I provide them for you. I don't want to go down into specific granularity as to what each one of them do because I don't want to give you bad dreams, and you're not going to blame me if you wake up in a cold sweat screaming in the middle of the night. But this is what we can do with these things. Again, let's think here about drugs and bugs. If we're looking at drugs, we're looking at what we call in-close pharmaceuticals. These are not weapons of mass destruction. These are weapons of mass disruption. What they can be used to do is create particular yet highly selective effects in individuals so that they can be delivered at very, very low doses, yet deliver a high amplification effect that's called a hormetic potential, to be able to alter cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. How do you do that? Well, you can work on key operatives. In other words, this individual who's sitting before me may be a diplomat. They are now coming to interact with me. They may have a posture that does not necessarily align with mine. Can I alter their cognition? Can I alter their affiliation? Can I alter their emotionality? And in such a way, might I be able to alter their behavior? Yeah, I can. And if, in fact, this individual possesses political or charismatic capability, charm, charisma, leadership potential, to then stand before their people and say, this guy's my best buddy now, they might go, well, I'm following this guy. Or they might think he's stark raving mad and I've created social disruption within his political ranks. I can do that on a variety of levels, from individuals who are head of a small family or group, to the tribal, to the community, to the large-scale population. So we can utilize these things to be able to affect key operators and dynamic individuals who may charismatically, politically, or through other means of power be able to affect groups. It's a ripple effect. It is a ripple effect. Moreover, we can induce a number of neuromicrobiological agents to then incur something called high morbidity. These are not necessarily mortal agents. We can modify the existing palette of bacteria and viruses through the use of gene editing techniques. Very viable. This has been some of my ongoing work with my colleague Diane DeEulis at National Defense University. And what we can also do is recognize that there are existing microbiologicals that can be harnessed to then induce the effects. We can also engage certain chemicals that way. What we want here is a morbidity factor, not necessarily a mortality factor. I want to make people sick. And what I do here is the virus is not necessarily the bug. The virus is what I put over the internet. Let me show you how I can crash a system pretty easily. I affect key individuals here, here, and here. And then I take another community in the back of the room. I affect key individuals there. And then I take another community. I affect key individuals there. And then I do what every good attributional group does. I beat my chest and take credit for it. And what I put out over the internet is, this is a virus, a bacteria, an agent that I have infiltrated into your fill in the blank. I say it's a weapon of mass destruction. And what I tell you it's going to do is it's going to produce paranoia, anxiety, and sleeplessness. What I've just done is I've recruited every paranoid hypochondriac to think that they have whatever that is. I've used salient and sentinel cases, and I create essentially a legion of what's known as the worried well. They now flood emergency rooms. They flood their clinicians. The CDC responds back and says, no, 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 there is no such a thing. And I've created a schism of trust between the population and the polis. It's both a short and a long war's effect. Moreover, I can create particular neuromicrobiologicals that may have a much longer duration of action. For example, modified Zika virus. And what I can then do is, as a consequence of that, is I can affect subsequent generations to incur a public health morbidity and mortality effect that then creates an increased economic and perhaps social burden. Long war scenario. If I wanted to do something that's a little bit more proximate, I can utilize nanoparticulate matter. Now, we can utilize nanoscience to create much better drugs, to get them where they got to go in the brain. I can create nanoscience and nanotechnology to be able to escort certain drugs across the proliferant barrier, which is the blood-brain barrier and cerebrospinal fluid barrier. So I get these things where they got to go. But I can also utilize nanoparticulate matter in a very indiscriminate way. The idea here is that I can get something called high CNS aggregation material that is essentially invisible to the naked eye and even to most scanners because it is so small that it selectively goes through most levels of filter porosity. These are then inhaled either through the nasal mucosa or absorbed through the oral mucosa. They have high CNS affinity. They clump in the brain or in the vasculature, and they create essentially what looks like a hemorrhagic diathesis, in other words, a hemorrhage predisposition or a clot predisposition in the brain. What I've done is I've created a stroking agent, and it's very, very difficult to gain attribution to do that. I can use that on a variety of levels, from the individual to the group, highly disruptive. And in fact, this is one of the things that has been entertained and examined to some extent by my colleagues in NATO and to those who are working on the use of neurobiological sciences to create populational disruption. Very, very worried about the potential for these nanoparticulate agents to be CNS aggregating agents to cause neural disruption, either as hemorrhagic and vascular disruptors or as actual neural network disruptors because they interfere with the network properties of various neural nodes and systems within the brain. Then I get to the area of devices. And this, in many ways, is going to be less than definitive. The reason for this is highly evolving, and I think is limited only in certain cases by context of imagination. What are the devices? Well, I have them here for you here. You have neurosensory mobilizing agents, and to some extent, some of these have already been used. Things like high-output sensory stimulators that can be administered from unmanned vehicles, drones, insect-borne, or larger-scale, macro-scale vehicles such as tanks, cars, etc. These are sensory mobilizing agents that use high electromagnetic pulse energy that may also utilize high levels of sound, high levels of light energy, and they disrupt neurological sensory function. Already being used, now they're being developed with higher specificity. The idea of intracranial pulse stimulators take this one step further. Now the idea is to utilize direct electromagnetic pulses to be able to disrupt neural network aggregation. There have been some animal studies that have been done that look at the viability of electromagnetic pulses across various distances to essentially disrupt the network properties of the brain and create confusional models. So these are both individual and group disruptors. You also have the idea of the altered reality tactics that is primarily used in irregular warfare. And here, once again, when we understand the construct of the way neural networks operate, they operate by key controller and influencing nodes that interact with other neural networks within the brain electrochemically. If we can utilize transcranial mechanisms to be able to disrupt this, what we can do is we can create disrupted neural network aggregation and literally disrupt people's sense of time, space, and place. And there have been a number of experiments that have examined this, more in the medical context of looking at how we can try to control epilepsy. And we do recognize that these things are viable, although they have not yet been translated directly into operational use. But they have been entertained for certain forms of special operations and irregular warfare, and so they're on the palette of possibility, although not near-term probability. Yeah. If we go one step further, I think it becomes important for us to also understand that we can utilize devices slightly differently. This is the idea of the sort of non-human cyborg. And I don't use that word in any way colloquially. I mean it literally. A cybernetic organism that is an integration between a biological system and a technological system. The pioneering work in this field was done years ago. It was Delgado's work with deep brain stimulation in a bull. He utilized deep brain stimulating electrode coupled to a remote device, got into the bull arena, induced the bull to charge, pressed the button, and arrested the bull's forward motion. Stopped, poised right before him. See what I can do through the use of cybernetic interactive systems. Remotely controlled brain systems, brain interfacing. Could we now utilize that on different scales? Well, we're not talking about dropping electrodes into people's heads, despite what people will say. This is not a large-scale program to infiltrate the population with indwelling electrodes. With all due respect to Elon Musk, I think the actual translation of that into a broad-scale event within the population, as at very, very least, speaks of the fantasy, if not fictional, and I think in many cases is very, very difficult to translate. Will key individuals get certain implants? Yes, I believe they will. Will key individuals also be able to get the benefits of translational neurosurgery that decrease some of the risks and burdens? Yes, they will. Will this be widely seen as a mechanism of individual and crowd control? No, it will not, at least not in the immediate future. But what has gone from the drawing board to the reality is this: the use of neural interfacing and physiological interfacing through the idea of remote-controlled small-scale systems to be able to modify the behavior of non-human animals on a variety of scales, small mammals, and increasingly the use of insects. The pioneering work was done by DARPA, something called the DARPA beetle or the DARPA fly. And more recently, an independent, non-DARPA-funded commercial enterprise, calls itself Dragonfly, has been able to utilize a combined set of techniques, both direct neural stimulation through the use of what we call macro technology and optogenetic control of key neuron firing patterns to be able to direct the wing beats and pulses, and as a consequence, directionality of a dragonfly. And characteristically, an insect of about that big works quite well because it can not only carry this particular payload, which is very, very light, and now does not have the burden of the prior DARPA beetle that needed a battery. This utilizes a solar rechargeable source, so it is infinitely powerful, but must also be able to bear the burden of now these very, very small scale, and in some cases, they're looking to the high-level nano or at least low-level micro scale use of various electrodes that can then both record and perhaps deliver certain types of payloads as well. So the idea of now going back to these very, very low dose nanopharmaceutical delivery of toxins or other chemicals and utilizing this as a controlled vector becomes a real possibility. Note, this has not been directly addressed, nor has it been entertained by any United States government entity in a public forum. This is not what DARPA has intended this device to be. This is supposed to be a surveillance device that could be used for public health and also to monitor key environmental factors. And the same is being touted here, that this is not a device that is weaponizable. The reason I tell you about it is that this was a point of considerable debate and discourse at the recent meeting of the European Union Human Brain Project Subcommittee on Dual Use. And I stood before these people and said to them, you know, this is not being entertained in these ways. And the response there was, yes, but it should. And so the fact that people are thinking about this, but this was not explicit intent, means that it is, in fact, capable to be developed in these directions. And that becomes a real concern and consideration. So when we're looking at this idea of neuroscience and technology for national security, intelligence, and defense, I think the take-home message here is that, yeah, we can access and affect, manipulate and control, so to speak, neural systems to affect, alter, change, direct minds via brains, and therefore the hearts in which those minds are embodied. We used to talk, as I said, about hearts and minds. Now, through the use of neuroscience and technology, minds and hearts is a far more viable description because it describes for us explicitly the root of engagement. What we can do here, I think, is very provocative. What we should do, that's still, I think, a point of contention and represents a work in progress. And I think the reason this becomes so contentious is that although we may even be able to leverage particular amounts of regulatory pre- and proscriptional control over large-scale governmental agenda that are dedicated to these efforts, and may even be able to exercise such control onto the commercial interface, a growing problem is the do-it-yourself biological market, what is commonly referred to as the biohacking community. And it's problematic not inherently because of what it is they do. This is public science. It's a science taken out into the public forum, utilizing available tools and technologies that indeed allow individuals to create highly valid scientific techniques and technologies in their backyard, in their basement. I think there's a strong push towards public science that in many ways is applaudable. And I'm not impugning the community nor its efforts. What I am doing is I'm putting out a warning. I'm giving forth sort of the need to take heed and perhaps take action. This is also a very vulnerable community. The reason for it is twofold. Number one, that there are individual actors, as with any community, who may have different agenda. And those agenda may not necessarily be, for what we consider to be always benevolent, wanting to do good purposes. Or let's face it, it could be wholly benevolent, but my good is not yours. And as a consequence, the ideology, purpose, and intent of what I seek to do may not necessarily be consistent with what you seek to do. Moreover, the level of financial base that would allow certain distinctions and certain integrities of control and safety may not be present in all of these operations. And as a result, accidental contamination, accidental spill out of one silo into the public silo may be burdensome, risky, or harmful to the public health. And then, of course, there is the relative corruptibility and diversion of that community by key individuals who may be susceptible to venture capitalists or other state or even non-state actors that have very, very discrete agenda, not all of them necessarily benevolent, or not all of them aligned with the key interests of here in the United States or some other country. There is a vulnerability profile that I think needs to be made aware. And of course, there has been a response to this, and there has been activity in this direction because this community is also dramatically and ongoing, dynamically interfacing with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Some of our conferences here at Livermore have been able to engage these partners in, I think, a very, very meaningful dialogue. And I urge this in a public forum, that this dialogue should continue, not in a suspicious way, but in a way that protects the individuals who are operating in the do-it-yourself biology community from their relative purloinment, and also recognizes that there are potential threats to not only that community, but the community at large, and as a consequence, national security and defense. The reason I tell you that is that this also speaks to what can be done and what should be done about it. And although I'd love to be able to stand before you now and say, here are the answers one by one, I can't do that. I can't, not in a definitive way. And one of the reasons for that is I think we can certainly talk from our own pulpit, and we can only discuss the palette that we have available and which we can manipulate here. Indeed, many of the things that I've spoken to you about with regard to biologicals, chemicals, toxins, they're controlled. But I think that the other issue then becomes twofold. Number one, that signatory treaties do not only guarantee compliance and performance, and number two, not everybody has signed the treaty. And if I go one step further, not everything I've talked about falls under the purview of the existing treaties. Case in point, these biologicals, in some cases, and these technologies and others. Put them all together, I get a much larger grab bag of combinatory approaches that can be used that are not explicitly addressed in the current signatory treaty's language, scope, or purpose. And as a consequence, what this does is it opens the door for possibility. Possibility certainly fosters probability. Moreover, this is being conducted on an international scale. Recent estimates, not speculations, I sound like a broken record, I talked about this morning, not speculations by the Neurotechnologies Industries Organization, has predicted that by 2025, greater than 50% of international neuroscience and technology will be conducted, listen to this, outside the West. Not outside the United States, not outside Europe, outside the West. Now that's an important consideration because what it demonstrates is a shift in the capability potential and ultimate power that can be yielded by this. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a thing. But I think it becomes important for you to understand is that this also needs consideration because of the fact that not all philosophies are aligned with our own. Moreover, the needs and values of other cultures may not necessarily be the same as ours. And they have every right in the world to be able to engage that cosmopolitan viewpoint. In other words, certain cultures have different philosophies that then acknowledge different needs and different values in distinct ways. And if in fact we recognize this, it demands a larger discourse, one that brings together international partners in a cooperative way to be able to both pulse the field and in some cases policy the field. And that's critical because failure to do anything right now leaves an opportunistic space wide open, and moreover, overt proscriptions in these areas without consideration for that opportunity space can incur certain vulnerabilities. This is not something you want to get caught with your pants down about. Level of proper investment, attention to detail, and engagement I think is important. Is this the only weaponizable form of science and technology? No. Is this a huge threat that leverages up there, for example, with nukes, dirty bombs? No. Is this certainly, I think, a growing reality, and as such, a viability for risk and threat? Yes. Does the appropriate level of attention need to be dedicated to it and action then need to be articulated thereupon? Yes, absolutely. Do I have a specific number or percentage of time, investment, and dollars that in fact should be dedicated to this? No, I don't, because I think it too needs to be iterative in keeping scope and pace with the science as it develops. On the world stage, as I said, you've seen non-state actors, you've seen do-it-yourself neurotechnologies, and increasingly, what we find is that this is becoming not only, I think, a valid concern, but a viable concern given the relative facility of neuroscience and technology. We can pull this stuff right off the shelf. Much of it, particularly in the direct-to-consumer space, then becomes available to do-it-yourselfer as well as a variety of state and non-state actors. Moreover, there are dedicated efforts by a number of states that are keenly investing in the neurosciences and neurotechnologies, many with explicit dual-use capability and potential. Third, this is being undertaken not only by nations, but by independent actors who are then being venture capital funded, both explicitly and implicitly, by various nations that have keen interest in developing a disrupted or at least directional balance of power in this opportunity space. And as I tried to show you in this lecture over these past 40 minutes or so, this can occur in a variety of applications. And the lack of commitment to at least an understanding and good depiction of it on our side can, in many cases, not only not preclude others' initiatives, but in some case, opportunize it. So clearly what we see is that this gives rise to a whole host of neuroethical, legal, and social issues. I'll not bore you with these in detail, but I think we can parse those into those that are focal to the technology, intersection of unknowns, their capabilities and limitations, and runaway effects, not only of the science and technology itself, but runaway effects of individuals who recognize its power and then take this into trajectories that we ordinarily would not assume would be engaged, because we may think there are limits and proscriptions. The idea that, well, we won't go there doesn't mean that someone else won't. Furthermore, I think that there are some ethical, legal issues that need to be raised, not only with regard to what we're doing with the science, but what can be done with it. The inviolability of mind and self, what we talked about earlier. Could we use these for interrogation? Could we use these in warfare? Yes, we could. Should we? But we could argue, well, less harm is going to be incurred, but really what are the harms once we get into the relative inviolability of the brain space, the last private domain, if you will? Oh yes, I know the counter-argument says we do that already, and perhaps that's valid. But I think developing that discourse in a very, very realistic way at the level of granularity that's necessary will be important to each and every step forward. Moreover, if in fact what we're looking to do is to be able to gain a broad base of information and be able to pulse that information through relative discrepancies and ultimately transgressions, we then get into arguments about what constitutes privacy, what constitutes protection, what is mitigation, what is manipulation, and then how do we entertain these things on the world stage. And if we're looking to say, well, we understand that perhaps we need to go in this direction, as many have argued, well, what ethics are we going to use? Some form of civilian ethics that's operative, for example, for the life sciences and medicine, perhaps, and that may be viable in research, but in translating research to operations, what do we use then? The idea of justification both in and for war, a just war and just conduct under war? Or perhaps we need to explore yet another ethical principle that was also very well explicated under the Augustinian maxim, which is the idea of jus contra bellum, which essentially means justification of use to prevent war. But how far do you go? To what extent? What represents benefit? What represents burden? What represents harm? I don't have answers, but what I can tell you is that this is certainly what we consider to be a science and technological superhighway. It's a superspeedway. And I like that analogy for a lot of reasons, because it's true. There are multiple lanes of entry and multiple lanes of competition. There are a lot of vehicles that are being entertained there. It's a very rapid pace. There are hazards. There are certainly race rules, and though not everybody obeys the race rules, and sometimes if you don't obey the rules, you get ahead of the pack. And of course, there are big prizes. But like any race, you know, the morbidity and mortality going at this speed, with this level of integrity, with this level of momentum, is real. So to be able to handle the superspeedway, one of the things that we've suggested is this, something we've called on-ramp. Get it? Speedway, on-ramp. There you go. It's the operational neurotechnology risk assessment and management process or paradigm. And what it really does is it embraces, I think, an older idea that had been advocated initially by Zbigniew Brzezinski, essentially in 1972. I won't bore you with the quote, you can read it yourself. But essentially the issue here was that the idea that the modification and manipulation through biochemical manipulation of the brain was seen as real in 1970 and has now been realized some 40 years later. This is a real speedway. This is not hypothetical. This is a race that was defined, and like so many other races that are defined, it's simply a question of the technological and scientific sophistication of the entries on the race. It's real. What it forces us to do is to evaluate the neuroscience and technology with regard to its capabilities and its limits. Don't make anything up. There's plenty there to really be concerned about. This is not a bunch of sit under a tree navel gazing and let's make up these hypothetical fictional scenarios. No neuroscience fiction here. Let's utilize neuroscience fact and do this in a capabilized way. Evaluate the real parameters of use. How could these be used? How could they not be used? And as a consequence of that, where do the real risks and threats really lie? What are the benefit, burden, harm parameters of using these or not using these? And ultimately, what are the contexts of applications? Intelligence, security, defense, public safety. In some cases, looking at the research side of the house and the operational side of the house. All of these must fit into this quasi-calculus of how we then approach risk assessment and mitigation. There's nothing new about this. This is a simple, tried and true risk assessment and mitigation paradigm that is now being applied to the use of neuroscience and technology in these key domains. What we've tried to do is to dial in the specificity through the use of some key questions. How do we do it? We identify the risk scenarios, try to model them, craft these strategies for preemption and preparation. Preparation is the big step. Strategies that are relevant and durable, and identifying the plan that's necessary. What do we try to do there is we try to develop these contingencies and exigencies. And in developing these things, it's essentially a four-step process. Looking at the technical rectitude, the right ways that one could utilize any neuroscience and technology. And what I mean by the right ways is using the techniques and technologies in correct ways. Using them in ways that are real, understanding the capabilities and limitations. What are the situational variables that are germane to their use? Could they be used this way or not? Yeah, I could say I want to neuroimage people, left, right, and middle, but am I going to get everybody in the scanner? No, I'm not. So how am I really going to use these things? Evaluation, ultimately a revision of these ethical concepts to guide use and frameworks for establishing and executing ethical engagement. Very important to do. These last two steps are work in progress. What we've called for in this approach is something called tasker. Groups of individuals can be assembled to look at the problem who are task agile, scientifically knowledgeable, and ethically responsible. Because what we're trying to do is balance the relative goods of neuroscientific and technological advancement with the relative burdens, risks, and harms of potential areas of dual use that could be employed and how those then affect national security and defense. We've called for a series of questions called W framing questions. What can the technology do? When will it be used? Under which circumstances? In whom? And then we frame these in what we call C contingencies. What is the actual capability of the science and technology? How it will affect the character of those upon which it is used? What are the consequences that its various use or non-use will occur? What are the contexts in which it may be employed, not employed, and what are the contingencies that go into that? And ultimately, are there issues of consent or non-consent that need to be defined? Because the thing you don't want to do, and the thing that we're arguing against, is doing this and getting this, is unraveling the potential Gordian knot of what the brain is, only to open a can of worms by so doing. It's not a question of not going forward. It's a question of looking at what we call footfall effects. It's not a prohibition or proscription against putting one foot in front of the other, but it's recognizing of where those feet are going to fall and what the consequences are where you put them down. And also recognizing we're not walking alone. Because ultimately, by taking that approach, which is a preparedness approach, what it allows you to do is to remain steady irrespective of your gait or your stance, and do so irrespective of who's pushing and who's pulling. Work in progress. I wanted you to be aware of the work that we're doing in neuroscience and technology can certainly be leveraged and I think advanced for good within biomedical and even broadly non-biomedical arenas with regard to public use, lifestyle use, and occupational use. But as with so many other things, this is a double-sided blade that can be leveraged not only for good, but for different definitions of good that in some cases can incur harm. No, 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 this is not cry wolf. Certainly the sky is not falling. But be able to differentiate a puppy from a dog from a wolf, recognize that wolves have teeth, recognize that wolves have claws, recognize that wolves have a pooper on the back end, and all those can get you in trouble. And no, as I said before, sky's not falling, but certainly looks like rain. Bring an umbrella. Because, as I like to say so many times, with neuroscience and neurotechnology comes great knowledge and great capability. With great capability comes tremendous responsibility. Those of you who are working in the field bear this responsibility. You know, my dad was an engineer. I say this at the end of every lecture I give, and I'll say it here unapologetically. And one of the things we used to like to do when I was a little kid, our sort of like father-son activity, was to build things and fix things. And I still like to work on airplanes and motorcycles and stuff. And when I was a little kid, my father had this thing he used to do. Every month, he'd give me a brand new tool. He was teaching me how to use tools. I got really excited after the first few tools. I thought I knew exactly how to use tools. I was a little kid. What did I know? And I remember once very, very vividly, he gave me this new tool. I want to run off and use it. He put his hand on my shoulder and he says, Jim, slow down. Measure twice. Cut once. Sometimes you can't go back. Wow, Dad. Great advice. Neuroscientists, neuroengineers, colleagues, friends, those of you working in national security, intelligence, defense, those of you working on the policy side of the house, let's measure twice. Let's cut once. Because sometimes all of us won't be able to go back. It's a difficult field. If you want to get in touch with me, you know where I live. It's right there. Hold on. Boom, boom, boom. It's right there. If you want more readings in the field, I'll provide these for you. Certainly this PowerPoint is available to you. This is the part of the lecture that is the unabashed self-promotional plug. If you'd like to read more deeply about the uses of neurocognitive sciences in national security, intelligence, and defense, I recommend this. There are other books. Certainly the reason I give you this is because I'm proud of it, not because I did it, but because it was an effort in bringing together great minds from an international perspective to be able to look at the field and at least illustrate some of the ethical issues, if not solve the ethical questions that go along with it. And once again, I think the thing that we need to understand is that realistically, whoops, boom, 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 come on, come on. There. The future's in our hands here. The brain's at our fingertips. The last thing in the world we want to do with this capability is fumble it. So with that, I'll end my presentation. I'll thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't bore, and there's plenty of time for questions. Thank you very much.